sentenced to life without parole.
No, it was him. He made me do it. You did this. You did this.
Mark Abrams was 12 years old when he found his parents, Michael and Nydia Abrams, dead in their Memphis, Tennessee home. Blood covered the hardwood floors. Their bodies lay crumpled, eyes open. Mark called 911, struggling to describe what he had discovered. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice contrasted sharply with Mark's frantic breathing. My parents, they're dead. There's blood everywhere. Please help me, he managed between sobs, collapsing against the hallway wall as far from the bodies as he could get while staying on the line. The dispatcher tried to soothe the hysterical boy, asking for the address and whether there was anyone else in the home. My brothers already left for school. I woke up late because I was sick. They don't know, Mark explained, unaware that his 16-year-old twin brothers Bobby and Oscar weren't merely absent, but were, in fact, the architects of the carnage surrounding him. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as first responders rushed to the upscale East Memphis neighborhood where the Abrams family had lived for the past decade. Officer Tanya Reynolds was first on the scene, approaching the front door with caution, her hand hovering near her service weapon as protocol demanded when responding to a possible homicide. The door stood ajar, and through the crack she could see a small figure huddled in the hallway, arms wrapped tightly around his knees. Memphis PD, she called out, pushing the door open wider and surveying the scene with practiced efficiency, though even her years on the force hadn't prepared her for the brutality awaiting inside. If you're watching this true crime documentary right now, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth coverage of shocking cases like this one. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from as we dive deeper into the tragic case. The living room told a story of violence, furniture overturned, a shattered coffee table, and blood spatter across the cream-colored walls, indicating a frenzied attack rather than a calculated execution. Michael Abrams lay face down near the sofa, multiple stab wounds visible on his back, while Nydia's body was found in the adjacent kitchen, apparently having tried to flee before being caught by her attacker. Officer Reynolds quickly secured the scene and guided young Mark outside to her patrol car, where he sat trembling, repeating over and over, who would do this? Who would hurt them? Detective James Martinez arrived 20 minutes later, his weathered face grim, as he took in the details of what would soon become one of the most disturbing cases of his 20-year career with the Memphis Police Department. The neighborhood quickly transformed into a hub of police activity, crime scene tape cordoning off the property, forensics teams in white coveralls moving methodically through the house, and curious neighbors gathering behind the barricades, whispering theories about what might have happened to the well-liked family. News vans began arriving within the hour, their satellite dishes extending skyward as reporters prepared to broadcast the breaking story of the double homicide that had shattered the peaceful Wednesday morning. The victims have been identified as Michael Abrams, 45, and his wife Nydia Abrams, 42, a respected child psychologist with a practice in downtown Memphis. A blonde reporter announced solemnly into a camera as officers continued their work behind her. Their 12-year-old son discovered the bodies this morning and called 911, while the couple's 16-year-old twin sons were reportedly at school when the murders occurred. Inside the mobile command center hastily set up across the street, Detective Martinez interviewed Mark with a child psychologist present, gently probing for any details that might help identify the perpetrator. "Did your parents have any enemies, Mark? Anyone who might want to hurt them?" Martinez asked, his voice soft, but his eyes sharp, missing nothing. The boy shook his head, then paused, a flash of recollection crossing his tear-stained face. "Dad's ex-wife, Rebecca, she called a lot lately. They would argue," he offered hesitantly, recalling the tense phone conversations he'd overheard in recent weeks. Mom said she was making threats because of some money stuff, Mark added, unwittingly providing investigators with their first lead, and unknowingly pointing them in exactly the direction his brothers had meticulously planned. By mid-morning, the twins were pulled from their classes at Memphis Central High School and brought to the station, ostensibly to be informed of their parents' deaths and reunited with their younger brother. Bobby and Oscar Abrams sat stone-faced as Detective Martinez delivered the devastating news, their reactions carefully measured, eyes appropriately widened, hands trembling just enough, voices cracking with what appeared to be shock and grief. "Who would do something like this?" Bobby asked, echoing his younger brother's earlier question, his blue eyes brimming with tears that never quite fell. Oscar, the more introverted of the twins, simply stared at the floor, occasionally nodding or shaking his head in response to the detective's gentle questioning. Neither betrayed any sign that just hours earlier they had plunged kitchen knives repeatedly into their parents' bodies before showering, changing into fresh clothes, and heading to school as if it were any other day. As the news of the Abrams murders spread throughout Memphis, the community responded with an outpouring of shock and sympathy for the three boys suddenly orphaned by this senseless act of violence. Nydia's colleagues at her psychology practice established a fund for the children, while the twins' classmates organized a candlelight vigil outside Memphis Central High School. Behind the scenes, however, Detective Martinez had already dispatched officers to locate Rebecca Winters, Michael's ex-wife, based on the information provided by Mark and corroborated by text messages found on Michael's phone. The messages revealed escalating hostility from Rebecca, including one sent just days before the murder that read, "You'll regret the day you ever crossed me, Michael." The twins, temporarily placed in the care of their maternal aunt, maintained their role as grieving sons with remarkable commitment, never once slipping out of character or revealing the cold calculation behind their patricide and matricide. The first 48 hours after a murder are crucial, and the Memphis Police Department worked around the clock processing evidence from the crime scene, interviewing neighbors, and building a timeline of the victim's final hours. In the Abrams kitchen, forensics technicians found a knife block with 2 weapons missing, consistent with the murder weapons that had been carried away by the killers and later disposed of in a storm drain 3 blocks from the house. A partial fingerprint on the kitchen counter didn't match either victim, but showed similarities to samples taken from Rebecca Winters during a previous arrest for disorderly conduct following her divorce from Michael. Hair fibers found clutched in Nydia's hand appeared to match Rebecca's distinctive auburn color, though DNA testing would take days to confirm. "We're looking at the ex-wife as a person of interest," Martinez told his superior during their evening briefing, unaware that the evidence pointing to Rebecca had been carefully planted by the twins, who had collected their father's ex-wife's hairs from an old brush left in the garage and strategically placed them at the scene. The Memphis Crime Lab hummed with activity as technicians processed the mountain of evidence collected from the Abrams home, their meticulous work illuminated by the harsh fluorescent lighting that cast no shadows and left nowhere for secrets to hide. Blood spatter analysis revealed a frenzied attack, with both victims suffering multiple stab wounds. Michael had been stabbed 17 times, primarily in the back and neck, while Nydia's wounds numbered 23, concentrated in her chest and abdomen. The medical examiner's preliminary report estimated time of death between 6:30 and 7:15 a.m., a narrow window that coincided precisely with when the twins claimed to have been walking to school, a journey that normally took them past houses with no external security cameras. Detective Martinez stood before the evidence board, studying crime scene photos and timeline markers, his instincts telling him something about this case wasn't adding up despite the seemingly straightforward evidence pointing to Rebecca Winters. The ex-wife's threats provide motive, and we have physical evidence potentially placing her at the scene. Detective Martinez explained to his partner, Detective Sarah Coleman, as they reviewed the case files. Coleman nodded thoughtfully, tapping her pen against her notepad where she'd written, "Twins. No reaction? Normal?" Her psychological training had flagged the brothers' responses as potentially problematic, though grief manifests differently in everyone, especially teenagers. "But something's off about those boys," she continued, voicing her concerns. "They're too composed, too perfect in their responses, like they're acting the way they think grieving sons should act, rather than actually grieving." While the detectives debated the twins' suspicious behavior, Bobby and Oscar Abrams sat in their first-period calculus class at Memphis Central High, maintaining their facade of normalcy with unsettling precision. Bobby raised his hand to answer questions, as he always did, while Oscar kept to himself, seemingly lost in the mathematical equations that had always come easily to both brothers. Their classmates gave them space, uncertain how to approach the twins who had, according to the morning news, lost both parents in a brutal attack. One girl, Emma Chen, who sat behind Oscar, later told detectives she had noticed something unusual that morning. Oscar's hands were shaking when he took notes, and there was a tiny spot of something red under his fingernail. "I thought it was ink at the time, but now I wonder." Her observation would eventually become a critical piece of evidence. But for now the twins continued their day, moving between classes with the numb efficiency of those operating on autopilot. Back at the crime scene, forensic technicians made a discovery that would later prove crucial. A bloody footprint in the upstairs hallway, partially obscured but preserving enough detail to determine it came from a size 11 athletic shoe with a distinctive tread pattern. The print appeared to match a popular brand of running shoes favored by many teenagers, including the Abrams twins, though the partial nature of the print made definitive identification challenging. More telling was its location. The print faced away from the master bedroom, where a small amount of blood had been found on the carpet, suggesting someone had walked from the bedroom toward the bathroom after the murders. This contradicted the theory that Rebecca Winters was the sole perpetrator, as witnesses confirmed she wore women's size 7 shoes and the bloody footprint was far too large to be hers. By mid-afternoon, Detective Martinez had secured a warrant to search Rebecca Winters' apartment and seize her electronic devices to establish her whereabouts at the time of the murders. Officers descended on her modest Midtown Memphis apartment, finding the place unoccupied but meticulously organized, with no obvious signs of someone who had recently committed a violent crime. Rebecca's closet revealed several pairs of shoes, none matching the footprint found at the crime scene, and her bathroom showed no evidence of the thorough cleaning one would expect after such a bloody encounter. The detectives bagged her hairbrush for DNA comparison with the strands found in Nydia's hand, along with her laptop and cell phone to track her movements on the morning of October 8th. "If she's our killer, she's one of the most organized I've ever seen," Detective Coleman remarked, noting the absence of any blood evidence in the apartment or car, despite the considerable blood loss at the murder scene. While investigators built their case against Rebecca Winters, the twins attended a counseling session arranged by their school, sitting side by side in matching postures of contained grief. "Can you tell me how you're feeling today?" the counselor asked gently, noting the brothers' synchronized breathing and mirrored body language, typical of twins, but also potentially indicative of their shared secret. Bobby spoke first, his voice carefully modulated to convey the appropriate level of distress without tipping into histrionics that might seem suspicious. "It doesn't feel real yet. I keep expecting to go home and see them there, Dad watching the game, Mom making dinner," he said, reciting lines he and Oscar had practiced that morning. Oscar nodded in agreement, adding his own rehearsed sentiment. "I'm worried about Mark. He's the one who found them, and he's just a kid." Neither twin mentioned their parents' recent punishment, the grounding that had stripped them of their phones, car privileges, and effectively ended their lucrative grade-changing business that had netted them thousands of dollars from desperate classmates. At the Memphis Police Department, digital forensic specialists worked to extract data from Michael and Nydia Abrams' devices, uncovering a series of tense email exchanges between Michael and Rebecca regarding missed alimony payments. The most recent email, sent just 3 days before the murders, contained what could be interpreted as a veiled threat. "You can't keep what's rightfully mine without consequences, Michael. I'm done playing nice." This discovery strengthened the case against Rebecca, providing a clear financial motive for the murders beyond simple animosity. Detective Martinez ordered officers to locate Rebecca, who had not returned to her apartment and wasn't answering her cell phone, her apparent evasion further cementing her status as the primary suspect. When they finally tracked her to her workplace, the local radio station where she hosted Real Talk with Rebecca, she appeared genuinely shocked by news of her ex-husband's murder, though the detectives noted this could easily be an act. "Rebecca Winters, we need to ask you some questions about your whereabouts this morning between 6:30 and 7:30 a.m., Detective Martinez stated firmly as he and Coleman approached the radio host in the station's lobby. Rebecca's face registered confusion, then horror as the implication of their presence dawned on her. "Michael and Nydia are dead? And you think she began, her voice rising with indignation. The detectives observed her reaction closely, looking for signs of deception or the relief of someone who had prepared for this moment. "I was on air doing my morning show. I've been here since 5:30 a.m. preparing, and we went live at 6 o'clock, she explained, gesturing toward the station manager who stood nearby. "We have dozens of witnesses, and the entire broadcast is recorded. Check the timestamps if you don't believe me." The station manager quickly confirmed her alibi, retrieving audio files and sign-in records that placed Rebecca firmly at the radio station during the critical time window when the Abrams were killed, effectively eliminating her as a suspect despite the seemingly damning evidence found at the scene. With Rebecca Winters' alibi confirmed beyond reasonable doubt, Detective Martinez returned to the station to regroup, the investigation now at a perplexing crossroads. If not the ex-wife, then who had murdered the Abrams with such brutality, and why plant evidence implicating Rebecca? The detective's thoughts turned back to the twins, their composed demeanor niggling at his experienced intuition. He pulled their school records, discovering that both boys were exceptional students with IQs in the gifted range, though several teachers had noted concerns about their manipulative tendencies and unusual emotional detachment. Most telling was a recent disciplinary report. The twins had been caught running an elaborate scheme, hacking into the school's grading system and charging fellow students $500 per grade change. "Parents informed and discipline administered," the report concluded. The last entry in what would be Michael and Nydia Abrams' final parental act. While Martinez pieced together the twins' possible motive, forensics delivered another crucial break in the case. DNA results from blood samples taken from the bathroom drain at the Abrams home revealed traces that matched neither victim. It appears someone washed up after the murders and, despite their efforts, left biological evidence behind, the lab technician explained, noting that without reference, samples from potential suspects, they couldn't determine whose DNA it was. Martinez immediately requested DNA samples from the Abrams children, presenting it to their aunt as a routine elimination process to narrow down their suspect pool. The twins exchanged a brief telling glance when informed of the request, but maintained their cooperative facade, agreeing to provide cheek swabs later that day. That momentary look between Bobby and Oscar didn't escape Martinez's notice. It was the first crack in their carefully constructed narrative, a silent communication that spoke volumes to the experienced detective. The day ended with a candlelight vigil for Michael and Nydia Abrams, hundreds of community members gathering outside their home with flowers, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes of condolence. Bobby and Oscar stood at the front of the crowd, arms protectively around their younger brother Mark, who sobbed openly into Bobby's shoulder, his grief unfeigned and devastating in its rawness. Local news cameras captured the scene. Three brothers united in tragedy, the older twins stoic pillars of strength beside their vulnerable younger sibling. "Our parents were everything to us," Bobby told a reporter, his voice breaking at precisely the right moment. "We just want whoever did this caught and punished." Behind the cameras, Detective Martinez watched the performance with growing certainty that he was witnessing not grief, but one of the most chilling examples of teenage sociopathy he had encountered in his career. The interrogation room at the Memphis Police Department was deliberately austere. Bare walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and uncomfortable chairs designed to increase the psychological pressure on its occupants. Bobby Abrams sat perfectly still, his posture relaxed despite the circumstances, as Detective James Martinez entered, carrying a thin folder and 2 cups of water. "Thanks for coming in to answer some follow-up questions, Bobby," Martinez began, his tone conversational, giving no indication that the teenager had transitioned from grieving son to prime suspect in the past 24 hours. Bobby nodded, maintaining eye contact with practiced ease, his hands resting palms down on the table, a confident, open posture that most guilty individuals instinctively avoided. "Of course, Detective, anything to help find who did this to our parents," he replied, the slight tremor in his voice perfectly calibrated to convey emotional distress without appearing overwrought. Detective Martinez began with routine questions, establishing Bobby's account of the morning of the murders. Waking at 6:15 a.m., showering, eating breakfast with Oscar, and leaving for school by 7 p.m. while their parents were still alive and their younger brother was sleeping in. "And you didn't notice anything unusual that morning? No arguments between your parents, no unexpected visitors?" Martinez pressed, watching Bobby's micro-expressions for any sign of deception. Bobby shook his head, his brow furrowing in apparent concentration as he mentally reviewed the morning's events. "Mom was making coffee. Dad was reading something on his tablet. It was totally normal," he insisted, his story perfectly aligned with Oscar's separate account, down to the minute details that most liars overlooked when constructing false narratives. In the adjacent interrogation room, Detective Coleman employed a different approach with Oscar, her questions seemingly random and disjointed, to prevent him from relying on rehearsed responses. "Your mother was a child psychologist, wasn't she?" Coleman asked abruptly, changing tactics after 20 minutes of standard questioning. Oscar blinked, momentarily thrown by the shift, but recovering quickly. "Yes, she had a practice downtown working mostly with troubled teens," he answered, uncertainty flickering across his face as he tried to discern the relevance. Coleman nodded thoughtfully, making a note in her folder before asking, "Did she ever try to psychoanalyze you and your brother? Professional habits are hard to break, even at home." The question was a calculated probe designed to test Oscar's emotional response to his mother and the flash of resentment that crossed his features, there and gone in an instant, told Coleman more than his measured reply about how his mother respected the boundaries between work and family. Martinez shifted his approach, abruptly placing a photograph of the bloody footprint found in the upstairs hallway on the table between them. "We found this at the crime scene, Bobby. Size 11 athletic shoe. Same brand you're wearing right now," he stated, watching the boy's reaction closely. Bobby glanced at the image, his expression remaining neutral save for a slight tightening around his eyes, a telling sign of cognitive processing rather than emotional response. "Lots of people wear these shoes, Detective," he replied evenly, his voice steady, but his left hand moving subtly to cover his right, a self-protective gesture the detective noted. Including your brother and several of your classmates, I'm sure, Martinez agreed amiably. We'll be asking everyone for their shoes to eliminate potential matches, just routine procedure. The interrogation continued for hours, with the detectives periodically switching rooms, comparing notes, and adjusting their strategies based on the twins' responses. "They're good, too good," Coleman remarked during a brief consultation in the hallway. "Their stories match perfectly, not just the facts, but the emotional beats, like they rehearsed not just what to say, but how to feel about it." Martinez nodded grimly, flipping through his notes where he'd circled several inconsistencies too minor to confront the boys with, but significant enough to raise his suspicions further. "They keep steering the conversation back to Rebecca Winters, mentioning the threatening calls, suggesting we check her phone records," he observed. "They're working very hard to point us in her direction without seeming to do so." Bobby leaned forward slightly, an earnest expression on his face as he volunteered information unprompted, a classic technique of liars trying to appear cooperative. "I just remembered something that might help. About 2 weeks ago, I overheard Dad on the phone with Rebecca, and he sounded really upset, saying something like, 'You can't keep threatening us,' and 'Stay away from my family,'" he recounted, his delivery smooth and convincing. Martinez nodded, making a show of writing this down, while wondering why such a pertinent detail had conveniently surfaced only now, hours into questioning. "That's helpful, Bobby," he acknowledged, then pivoted unexpectedly. "Let's talk about the grade-changing scheme at school. That must have been quite the operation to warrant such serious consequences." For the first time, a genuine reaction flickered across Bobby's face, surprise followed by carefully controlled anger, his fingers tensing against the table. "That was a misunderstanding," he replied, his voice noticeably cooler. "The school overreacted to what was basically just us helping some friends study." Martinez raised an eyebrow, consulting a document in his folder. "According to the disciplinary report, you and Oscar hacked the school's grading system and charged other students $500 per grade change. That's quite a bit more than helping friends study, wouldn't you say?" Bobby's eyes narrowed slightly, calculating his response. "The school couldn't prove anything because we didn't do it," he insisted, though his defensiveness contrasted sharply with his previous cooperative demeanor. "But your parents believed the accusations, didn't they? They grounded you, took away your phones, car privileges. Must have been frustrating after running such a profitable little business." In the other room, Oscar was beginning to show signs of fatigue, his carefully maintained facade developing hairline fractures as Detective Coleman circled back to questions she'd asked hours earlier, looking for inconsistencies. "You mentioned earlier that you last saw your mother making coffee in the kitchen, but your brother said she was packing lunches. Which was it?" she asked casually, though the discrepancy was minor and potentially attributable to normal memory variations. Oscar hesitated, momentarily uncertain, his eyes flicking to the ceiling as he mentally reviewed his script. "She was doing both, I guess, making coffee first, then starting on lunches while we ate breakfast," he amended, the slight delay in his response noted by Coleman. "And what were you and Bobby discussing at breakfast? Must have been something important, given you were both up and ready so early on a school day when you'd just been grounded." The twins' synchronized stories began showing more significant divergences as the interrogation passed the 4-hour mark, their mental stamina flagging under the relentless questioning. Bobby claimed they'd discussed an upcoming history test, while Oscar mentioned a group project in biology, minor discrepancies, but telling ones for 2 individuals claiming to have experienced the same morning. More damning was their inability to recall specific details about their parents' appearance or actions that morning, what their father was wearing, whether their mother had her hair up or down. Small details that genuine witnesses typically remembered, but fabricated accounts often overlooked. "I think we're done here for today," Martinez finally announced, closing his folder after Bobby failed to recall whether his mother had been wearing her usual work clothes or casual attire. We may have more questions later, so don't leave town. As the twins were released to their aunt's custody, Martinez and Coleman compared notes with the department's forensic psychologist, Dr. Eleanor Hayes, who had observed the interrogations via closed-circuit television. Classic signs of duping delight in both subjects, Hayes noted, referring to the subtle satisfaction liars often display when they believe they're successfully deceiving others. Bobby is the dominant personality, answering questions more confidently and redirecting when cornered. Oscar follows his brother's lead, but shows more anxiety markers, increased blinking, throat-clearing, defensive posture. The psychologist's assessment aligned with the detective's impressions, strengthening their conviction that the twins were involved despite the lack of definitive physical evidence linking them to the crime. They're counting on being minors, on their apparent grief, and on the evidence pointing to Rebecca Winters, Hayes concluded. But they underestimated how transparent rehearsed emotions appear to trained observers. Meanwhile, the twins returned to their aunt's home, maintaining their performance for the benefit of their younger brother and their temporary guardian. "How did it go?" their aunt asked worriedly, as they entered the living room where Mark sat, watching television, his eyes red-rimmed from crying. Bobby shrugged, the picture of adolescent nonchalance masking deeper emotions. "Same questions over and over. They're just doing their jobs, trying to figure out who killed Mom and Dad," he explained, his voice carefully modulated to convey appropriate gravity, without triggering Mark's fresh grief. Oscar nodded in agreement, though a muscle twitched in his jaw, a tell that only his twin would recognize as suppressed anger. "They're still looking at Dad's ex-wife," he added, maintaining their agreed-upon narrative, despite the detective's obvious shift in focus during questioning. That evening, as Memphis news stations reported on the ongoing investigation into the Abrams murders, camera crews captured footage of Rebecca Winters leaving the police station after providing fingerprints and DNA samples to eliminate her as a suspect. "I'm cooperating fully with the investigation because I have nothing to hide," she told reporters, her voice steady despite her obvious distress. "Michael was my ex-husband, yes, and we had our differences. But I could never harm him or Nydia." Inside their aunt's guest bedroom, the twins watched the broadcast silently, exchanging meaningful glances as Rebecca's alibi was mentioned. The perfect frame they had constructed now crumbling as investigators turned their attention elsewhere. Bobby switched off the television and turned to his brother, lowering his voice to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. "We stick to the story no matter what," he whispered, his expression hardening with resolve. "They have nothing but theories. As long as we stay consistent, they can't touch us." Rebecca Winters sat across from Detective Martinez in the interrogation room, her posture rigid with indignation despite the hour of questioning she had already endured. "I've provided alibi witnesses, time-stamped audio recordings of my show, security camera footage from the station parking lot, and cell phone data that proves I was nowhere near the Abrams house that morning," she enumerated, frustration evident in her clipped tones. Martinez nodded, acknowledging the overwhelming evidence supporting her whereabouts during the crucial time frame. "We appreciate your cooperation, Ms. Winters, but we still need to understand the nature of your recent communications with Michael," he explained, sliding printouts of text messages across the table. "These messages could be interpreted as threatening. Can you explain the context?" Rebecca sighed deeply, pushing a strand of auburn hair behind her ear, the same distinctive color as fibers found clutched in Nydia Abrams' hand, a connection now revealed as suspicious rather than incriminating. Michael was 3 months behind on alimony payments, claiming financial hardship while simultaneously posting vacation photos from Cancun on social media, she explained, her expression darkening at the memory. "I was angry and said things I shouldn't have, but threatening texts are a far cry from double homicide." The detective studied her face, finding none of the micro-expressions or behavioral indicators of deception he had observed in the twins, just genuine anger at her ex-husband's financial manipulations and horror at being implicated in his murder. Besides, Rebecca continued, leaning forward intently, if I were planning to kill Michael, why would I create such an obvious paper trail of threats beforehand? I'm not an idiot, detective. Her point was valid and aligned with Martinez's growing suspicion that the evidence against Rebecca had been deliberately planted. Too perfect, too convenient. A frame job executed with adolescent logic that assumed police would follow the most obvious leads without digging deeper. One more question, Ms. Winters, Martinez said, retrieving a small evidence bag containing several strands of auburn hair. We found these at the crime scene, clutched in Nydia Abrams' hand, and they appear to match your hair color. Can you explain how they might have gotten there? Rebecca stared at the bag, bewilderment crossing her features. I haven't been in that house since the divorce 5 years ago, she insisted, then paused, realization dawning. Wait, Michael kept boxes of my things in the garage that he never returned. Old clothes, some books, my hairbrush. He claimed he forgot they were there whenever I asked for them back. Back at the precinct, Detective Coleman reviewed school security footage that captured the twins arriving at Memphis Central High School on the morning of the murders, their demeanor notably calm as they entered the building at 7:32 a.m. They're too composed, she remarked to Martinez as they watched the grainy video, noting the twins' relaxed gait and easy conversation with classmates, showing none of the distraction or anxiety one would expect from teenagers who had just committed patricide and matricide. The timing was tight but feasible. The medical examiner had narrowed the time of death to between 6:40 and 7:10 a.m., giving the boys barely enough time to commit the murders, clean up, and walk to school. They didn't take their usual route that morning, Coleman observed, comparing the October 8th footage with recordings from previous days. Normally they're seen on the west entrance camera at around 7:25, but that day they came in through the east doors at 7:32. The alternate route presented a critical breakthrough. It passed near a series of storm drains where, following Coleman's hunch, officers recovered 2 kitchen knives matching the set from the Abrams home, wrapped in a blood-soaked towel and wedged deep within the drainage system. The weapons still bore traces of blood despite exposure to water, and preliminary testing matched the blood to both victims. We've got the murder weapons, Martinez announced during the afternoon briefing, though he tempered the team's excitement. But without fingerprints or other physical evidence directly linking the twins to the knives, it's still circumstantial. The forensic technician cleared her throat, drawing the detective's attention to her preliminary report. There's something else. The blood patterns on the knives suggest they were used by right-handed and left-handed attackers, respectively, she noted. The angle of the cutting edge relative to the blood flow indicates different dominant hands. This revelation sent Coleman back to the twins' school records, where she confirmed what now seemed a damning coincidence. Bobby was right-handed, Oscar left-handed. Identical twins, opposite-handedness, she murmured, adding this detail to the mounting evidence board where the case against the brothers was taking shape. Further examination of school security footage revealed another telling detail. A small, dark stain on Oscar's sleeve as he entered the building, visible for only a few frames before he adjusted his jacket to cover it. The enhancement shows the stain is consistent with blood spatter, the forensic video analyst confirmed, though the image quality precluded absolute certainty. And look at their shoes, both wearing the same brand of athletic footwear noted in the crime scene footprint. While physical evidence accumulated, Martinez pursued the psychological angle, interviewing teachers and classmates about the twins' behavior in the weeks leading up to the murders. A concerning pattern emerged of escalating resentment toward authority figures, particularly their parents. Bobby became visibly angry when I mentioned calling his mother about his declining participation grade, reported his English teacher, Ms. Hernandez. He said something like, "She thinks she knows everything about teenagers because of her job, but she doesn't know anything about her own sons. Other teachers described similar incidents, with both twins noting a sharp increase in defiant behavior following their grounding for the grade-changing scheme. Oscar told me his parents were destroying his future by restricting his college fund access as punishment, his guidance counselor recalled. He seemed more coldly furious than typical teenage rebellion. It was unsettling enough that I made a note to follow up with his mother. That follow-up never occurred, as Nydia Abrams was murdered before the scheduled parent-teacher conference where her son's concerning behavior would have been discussed. The irony of a child psychologist missing the warning signs in her own children became a focal point of the investigation, with colleagues from Nydia's practice providing insight into her professional blind spot. Nydia was brilliant with her patients, but sometimes applied different standards at home, Dr. Lillian Park explained during her interview. She once mentioned that Bobby and Oscar were too intelligent to act out in the self-destructive ways she saw in her practice. She believed their rational minds would prevail over typical teenage impulses. This fundamental misunderstanding of her son's psychology may have led Nydia to underestimate the twins' reaction to having their lucrative scheme shut down and their privileges revoked. The financial aspect of the grade-changing operation proved substantial when investigators obtained subpoenas for the twins' bank records, discovering multiple cash deposits totaling over $12,000 in the 6 months preceding their parents' deaths. They were running a sophisticated business, Coleman explained during the case review, displaying bank statements alongside a ledger found hidden in Oscar's calculus textbook. Each grade change was documented with student initials, amount paid, and date of service, meticulous record-keeping. The scheme had ended abruptly 3 weeks before the murders when a school IT administrator detected unauthorized access to the grading system and traced it back to computers used by the twins. Michael and Nydia's response had been swift and severe, grounding the boys indefinitely, restricting their access to electronics, and threatening to inform colleges about the academic dishonesty, effectively jeopardizing the twins' futures at elite universities. Most damning was the discovery made when detectives finally gained access to Oscar's personal laptop, hidden beneath floorboards in the brothers' bedroom closet, a laptop their parents hadn't known existed and therefore hadn't confiscated during the grounding. Browser history revealed extensive research on topics including undetectable poisons, staging crime scenes, and framing someone for murder, along with specific searches about Rebecca Winters, including her radio show schedule and past conflicts with Michael. They planned this methodically, Martinez told the district attorney during their preliminary meeting to discuss charges. The searches date back almost 6 months, but intensified after the grounding. The school punishment wasn't the motive, just the final trigger after a long period of resentment building against their parents. While the case against the twins strengthened, Mark Abrams struggled with growing suspicions about his brothers, memories surfacing that took on new, sinister meanings in light of recent events. Detective Martinez, the 12-year-old said hesitantly during a follow-up interview at his aunt's home, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I didn't tell you before." Martinez nodded encouragingly, keeping his expression neutral despite his internal alertness at this potential breakthrough. "The night before it happened, I heard Bobby and Oscar talking in their room really late," Mark continued, tears welling in his eyes. "They were arguing about something, and Bobby said, 'It has to be tomorrow morning before school.' And Oscar said he wasn't sure, and Bobby told him to stop being weak." The boy's hands trembled as he spoke, the weight of betrayal evident in his hunched shoulders. "I thought they were talking about confronting Dad about the grounding, asking for their phones back. I never thought they couldn't have meant." With Mark's testimony providing the final piece, Detective Martinez secured search warrants for the twins' DNA and their aunt's home where they were staying, focusing particularly on shoes matching the bloody footprint found at the crime scene. The twins maintained their composure when officers arrived to execute the warrants, surrendering their shoes and submitting to DNA swabs without protest, their confidence still unshaken in the perfection of their plan. "This is ridiculous," Bobby complained to their increasingly concerned aunt. "Why aren't they looking for the real killer instead of harassing us while we're grieving?" His practiced indignation rang hollow to the officers collecting evidence who had seen the mounting case against the brothers and recognized the performance for what it was. Behind the twins' calculated facade, however, the first real cracks were beginning to show. Oscar's hands shook slightly as he signed the consent form, and Bobby's gaze lingered too long on his brother's nervous tell, a flash of irritation crossing his features at this potential weakness in their united front. The forensics lab worked through the night, prioritizing DNA analysis from the samples collected at the Abrams home against the newly obtained reference samples from the twins. By morning, the results confirmed what Detective Martinez had already come to believe. Blood found in the upstairs bathroom drain contained DNA matching both Bobby and Oscar Abrams, distinct from their parents' profiles despite the familial similarities. They cleaned up after the murders but didn't realize trace evidence would remain in the plumbing, the lab technician explained, handing over the official report that would serve as a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. Martinez nodded grimly, adding the DNA match to his growing evidence file alongside shoe impressions that perfectly matched Oscar's size 11 athletic shoes, complete with a distinctive wear pattern on the right heel that aligned with the partial print found at the crime scene. Armed with physical evidence and witness statements, Martinez and Coleman prepared for the crucial interrogation that would determine whether they could extract confessions from either twin. "We need to separate them completely this time," Martinez instructed the team, recognizing the psychological advantage of isolating the brothers who had relied on each other's presence to maintain their deception. "Bobby's the dominant personality, but Oscar's shown more signs of stress. He's our best chance at getting one of them to break." The detectives devised a strategic approach, planning to inform Oscar first about the DNA evidence and Mark's testimony, allowing that information to destabilize him before Bobby could provide guidance or reinforcement for their shared narrative. "It's critical that Bobby believes we're focusing on him while we work on Oscar," Coleman added. "His ego won't allow him to imagine his brother might be the weak link." Oscar Abrams sat alone in interrogation room B, his usual mirror image twin conspicuously absent as Detective Coleman entered with a thick case file and serious expression. "We need to talk about the DNA evidence, Oscar," she began without preamble, noting the immediate tension in the teenager's shoulders. "We found your blood mixed with your parents in the bathroom drain. Can you explain how it got there?" Oscar's carefully maintained facade flickered momentarily, his eyes darting to the closed door, as if expecting Bobby to enter and take control of the situation. "That's impossible," he finally responded, his voice steady but lacking its usual conviction. "I cut myself shaving a few days before. That must be what you found." Coleman nodded as if considering this explanation, then placed a photograph on the table showing the bloody footprint with comparison markers matching it to Oscar's shoe. "And this print that matches your shoe exactly, was that from shaving too?" In the adjacent room, Bobby faced Detective Martinez with his customary confidence, unaware that the primary interrogation strategy targeted his brother rather than him. "You can keep me here all day, Detective, but it won't change the facts," he stated coolly, leaning back in his chair with calculated nonchalance. "My brother and I were walking to school when our parents were killed. You're wasting time that could be spent finding the real murderer." Martinez maintained a neutral expression, deliberately withholding the news about the DNA match and Mark's testimony, allowing Bobby to believe his denials remained credible. Let's talk about the grade-changing scheme at school, Martinez pivoted, watching Bobby's expression harden at the mention of the incident that had triggered the fatal conflict with his parents. $12,000 is a lot of money for a couple of high school students. What were you planning to do with it? Oscar's resistance began crumbling under Coleman's methodical presentation of evidence. The DNA match, the footprint, the blood on his sleeve captured by security cameras, and finally his younger brother's testimony about overhearing the twins' planning conversation. "Mark heard you, Oscar," Coleman said gently, sliding a transcript of Mark's statement across the table. "He's carrying the burden of knowing his brothers killed his parents. Is that what you want for him? To live with that knowledge and the responsibility of either reporting you or protecting killers?" Tears welled in Oscar's eyes for the first time since the investigation began, genuine emotion breaking through the carefully constructed facade as he considered his younger brother's suffering. "It wasn't supposed to happen like that," he whispered, the first implicit acknowledgement of involvement. "Dad was just supposed to get hurt enough to understand he couldn't control us anymore, but then Mom came in, and everything went wrong." Meanwhile, Bobby remained defiant, dismissing each piece of evidence Martinez presented as circumstantial or misinterpreted. "So we researched some dark stuff online. We're teenagers interested in true crime shows," he argued, explaining away the damning browser history. "And of course, our DNA is in the house. We lived there. None of this proves anything." His confidence wavered only slightly when Martinez mentioned Mark's testimony, a flash of betrayal crossing his features before he regained control. "Mark's just confused, mixing up conversations he overheard. We were talking about confronting Dad about the unfair punishment, not planning to hurt anyone." The detective nodded thoughtfully, making notes while concealing the fact that Oscar was simultaneously providing a very different account in the next room. The breakthrough came 90 minutes into Oscar's interrogation, when Coleman strategically suggested that Bobby was considering a deal to implicate his brother as the primary aggressor. "Bobby's smart. He knows the physical evidence points more strongly to your involvement," she explained, showing Oscar the shoe print comparison again. "He's already hinting that you were the one who lost control, that he tried to stop you but couldn't." This calculated deception struck at the core of the twins' relationship, the unspoken competition, and Bobby's lifelong psychological dominance over his brother. Oscar's expression shifted from uncertainty to anger, years of resentment surfacing as he contemplated this ultimate betrayal. "That's a lie," he snapped, his voice rising. "It was Bobby's idea from the beginning. He's the one who said we had to eliminate the problem if we wanted our freedom back." As Oscar's restraint crumbled, Coleman gently encouraged him to tell the complete truth, emphasizing that cooperation would be viewed favorably by the prosecutor. "Just tell me what happened that morning, Oscar," she prompted, pushing a legal pad across the table. "In your own words, no one else's version influencing you." The teenager stared at the blank page for several long moments, the weight of decision visible in his slumped shoulders and conflicted expression. Finally, he picked up the pen and began writing, detailing the premeditated plan conceived after their parents confiscated their phones and threatened to contact colleges about their academic dishonesty. "Bobby said we had one advantage. No one would suspect good kids like us of doing something so extreme," Oscar wrote, his handwriting growing steadier as he committed to his confession. "We decided to frame Rebecca because Dad was always complaining about her harassment, so the police would have an obvious suspect." The written confession described the morning of October 8th in chilling detail, how the twins had risen earlier than usual, retrieved the kitchen knives they had selected days before, and waited for their father to enter the living room with his morning coffee. "Bobby attacked first, stabbing Dad in the back before he could turn around," Oscar wrote, recounting how Michael had stumbled forward in shock, dropping his coffee mug as Bobby continued stabbing him with methodical precision. Mom heard the noise and came running from the kitchen, screaming when she saw Dad on the floor. I wasn't supposed to hurt her. That wasn't the plan. But Bobby yelled at me to finish it, or we'd both be caught. Oscar described Nydia's desperate attempt to flee back to the kitchen, how he had pursued her with the second knife, his mind strangely calm as he caught up to her and delivered the fatal wounds, her hand grabbing at his hair during the struggle, and coming away with strands they later replaced with Rebecca's hair from the old brush in the garage. While Oscar's confession unfolded in painstaking detail, Bobby remained resolute in the adjacent room, unaware that his carefully constructed alibi was collapsing. "I want to speak to my brother," he demanded. After 2 hours of questioning, his composure finally showing signs of strain, as Martinez continued to withhold the fact that Oscar was cooperating. "We're done here until I can talk to Oscar." The detective closed his folder deliberately, fixing Bobby with a steady gaze. "That might be difficult, considering Oscar is currently providing a full confession, implicating you as the mastermind behind your parents' murders," Martinez stated, watching the teenager's expression shift from confidence to disbelief. "He's been quite specific about your role in planning the murders, selecting the weapons, and instructing him to kill your mother when she witnessed your attack on your father." Bobby's carefully constructed facade shattered instantly, rage replacing his calculated control as he absorbed the reality of his brother's betrayal. "He's lying," he shouted, slamming his hands on the table with such force that the water glasses jumped. "I never told him to kill Mom. That was all him. He went crazy when she started screaming, stabbing her over and over, even after she stopped moving." The outburst constituted an inadvertent confession, confirming his presence and participation, while attempting to shift the worst of the blame to Oscar. Martinez maintained his professional composure despite the breakthrough, calmly activating the recording device on the table that had been running throughout the interrogation. "For the record, could you clarify what you just said about your brother killing your mother?" he asked, watching realization dawn on Bobby's face as he recognized the trap he had fallen into, his own words now irrevocable evidence of his guilt. The twins were formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder later that day, their status as juveniles quickly overshadowed by the prosecutor's announcement that they would be tried as adults given the premeditated nature of the crimes and the extensive evidence of planning. News of their arrest sent shockwaves through Memphis, the community struggling to reconcile the image of the grieving sons with the calculated killers revealed by the investigation. Mark Abrams, now effectively orphaned by both murder and betrayal, was placed in the permanent custody of his maternal grandparents, who relocated him to another state to escape the media scrutiny and provide a fresh start away from the shadow of his brother's crimes. It's the most comprehensive case of juvenile patricide and matricide I've seen in 20 years of prosecution, District Attorney Eleanor Phillips told reporters at the press conference announcing the charges. "The level of planning, the deliberate framing of an innocent person, and the complete lack of remorse demonstrated by these defendants demand the fullest prosecution under the law." The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following month, with prosecutor Victoria Wilson assigned to the case and Judge Harold Phillips presiding over what was already being called the honor roll murders by the local press, a reference to the twins' academic achievements that had masked their sociopathic tendencies. Detective Martinez submitted his final case report with a personal addendum reflecting on the investigation's psychological dimensions. "The most disturbing aspect of this case is not the brutality of the murders, but the performance that followed," he wrote, summarizing the twins' elaborate deception. For nearly a week, Bobby and Oscar Abrams maintained a facade of grief while actively manipulating the investigation, attending school counseling sessions, and even their parents' funeral arrangements without displaying genuine remorse or guilt. This level of emotional detachment and calculation in 16-year-olds suggests long-standing personality disorders that went unrecognized despite their mother's professional training, a tragic irony that ultimately cost both parents their lives. The interrogation room seemed smaller somehow as Detective Martinez settled in for what would become the most critical phase of the Abrams murder investigation. Bobby Abrams sat across from him, the teenager's initial bravado now replaced with a cold calculation that was perhaps more unsettling than his previous performance of grief. "Let's be clear about what's happening here, Bobby," Martinez began, his voice calm but authoritative as he arranged several file folders on the table between them. "Your brother has given us a complete statement detailing both your roles in planning and executing your parents' murders." Bobby's eyes narrowed slightly, the only visible reaction to this information, though Martinez noted the subtle tightening of his jaw muscles, a tell the detective had observed throughout their previous interactions when the boy felt cornered. "Oscar's always been weak," Bobby replied after a calculated pause, his tone dismissive yet tinged with genuine anger at his twin's betrayal. "He'd say anything if you pressured him enough. That doesn't make it true." The detective nodded thoughtfully, as though considering this perspective, then deliberately opened the top folder to reveal crime scene photographs of Michael and Nydia Abrams, their bodies contorted in death. Blood pooled around them on the floors of their Memphis home. "These are your parents, Bobby," Martinez stated flatly, watching the teenager's reaction closely. "Not abstract concepts, not obstacles to your freedom. Two human beings who raised you, provided for you, and tried to correct your behavior when you broke the rules." Bobby's gaze flicked to the photos, then away, his expression remaining impassive in a display of emotional detachment that confirmed Martinez's assessment of his psychological profile. In the adjacent observation room, Prosecutor Victoria Wilson watched the interaction on monitors alongside Detective Coleman and the department psychologist, Dr. Hayes. "He's not giving us anything," Wilson remarked, concern evident in her voice. "We have Oscar's confession, but juries respond better to emotional displays of remorse or at least recognition of the gravity of the crime." Dr. Hayes studied Bobby's body language on the screen, noting the controlled breathing and deliberately relaxed posture. "He's still performing, still believes he can manipulate the situation to his advantage," she observed. "Martinez needs to disrupt that belief system, create cognitive dissonance that forces Bobby to reconcile his self-image as the clever mastermind with the reality that he's been outmaneuvered." Back in the interrogation room, Martinez shifted strategies, setting aside the crime scene photos and instead producing a transcript of Oscar's confession. "Your brother was quite specific about the planning process," he noted, scanning the document as if refreshing his memory, though he knew the contents by heart. "According to Oscar, you first suggested eliminating your parents 3 months before actually doing it, shortly after they restricted your social media access for talking back to your mother." Bobby's expression remained neutral, but his fingers began tapping rhythmically on the table, another stress tell Martinez had cataloged. "That's ridiculous," the teenager responded, his voice steady despite the increasing tempo of his tapping. "If we were planning murder for 3 months, don't you think we'd have done a better job of it? Not left evidence all over the place?" Martinez allowed a small smile, seizing on this inadvertent acknowledgement. "So you admit there was planning involved, just not as far back as Oscar claims?" he pressed, watching Bobby realize his mistake. The teenager recovered quickly, shifting in his chair and folding his hands to stop the revealing finger tapping. "I'm not admitting anything. I'm pointing out the logical inconsistency in whatever story Oscar's concocted," he countered, his voice taking on the slightly pedantic tone he often adopted when attempting to establish intellectual superiority. It's basic common sense that premeditated murderers take precautions against leaving evidence. The detective nodded thoughtfully, then countered with the psychological insight that would become a turning point in the interrogation. Unless, of course, they believe they're too intelligent to get caught, that their superior intellect will allow them to outwit the investigators regardless of physical evidence. For the first time, Bobby appeared genuinely unsettled, the detective's assessment striking too close to the underlying arrogance that had informed the twins' planning. Martinez pressed his advantage, leaning forward slightly. That's what this was really about, wasn't it, Bobby? Not just freedom from your parents' discipline, but a chance to prove how much smarter you were than everyone, the police, the school administrators who caught your grade-changing scheme, even your mother with all her psychological training. Bobby's expression darkened, a flash of the rage that had driven the murders briefly visible before he reasserted control. "You don't know what you're talking about," he responded, though the slight tremor in his voice betrayed the accuracy of Martinez's analysis. The detective changed tactics again, closing the file folders and adopting a more conversational tone. "Let's talk about the morning of October 8th, he suggested, as if they were simply clarifying details rather than discussing patricide and matricide. "Walk me through what happened after your mother came into the living room and saw what you'd done to your father." Bobby hesitated, clearly weighing his options. Maintain complete denial despite the mounting evidence and his brother's confession, or attempt to minimize his role by providing a version that shifted primary responsibility to Oscar. His natural instinct to control the narrative ultimately won out. "I didn't do anything to my father," he insisted, though the qualification was telling. "Oscar was the one who lost control. I was just there when it happened." Martinez nodded encouragingly, deliberately misinterpreting this limited admission as the beginning of a full confession. "So you were present during the attacks but didn't participate, is that what you're saying?" he clarified, giving Bobby an opportunity to construct a defense narrative that might seem more favorable than Oscar's account. The teenager hesitated, then nodded cautiously. "Oscar had been talking about hurting them for weeks, but I never thought he'd actually do it," he claimed, the practiced sincerity in his voice contrasting with the calculated look in his eyes. "That morning he just snapped, grabbed the knife, and went after Dad while he was drinking his coffee. I tried to stop him, but everything happened so fast, and then Mom came in screaming, and Oscar went after her too." In the observation room, Dr. Hayes shook her head at this transparent attempt to rewrite the narrative. "Classic Darvo, deny, attack and reverse victim and offender," she commented to Wilson and Coleman. "He's positioning himself as the helpless bystander, maybe even the attempted hero, while casting Oscar as the sole aggressor. It's textbook behavior for manipulative personalities when confronted with irrefutable evidence of wrongdoing." The prosecutor made notes on her legal pad, already anticipating how she would counter this strategy during trial. "We'll need to emphasize the physical evidence that contradicts this version, particularly the wound patterns, indicating two attackers, and the DNA evidence showing both twins' blood mixed together in the drain from when they cleaned up." Detective Martinez allowed Bobby to complete his alternative narrative before calmly dismantling it with forensic facts. "That's an interesting version of events, Bobby," he acknowledged, reopening one of his folders to retrieve the medical examiner's report. "But it doesn't explain why your father was stabbed 17 times, with wound patterns clearly indicating a right-handed attacker, like yourself, while your mother's wounds show evidence of a left-handed attacker, like Oscar." Bobby's confidence faltered visibly as Martinez continued methodically. "It also doesn't explain why we found both your DNA and Oscar's mixed together in the bathroom drain, or why the bloody footprint in the hallway matches Oscar's shoe, or why your browser history shows months of searches about perfect murders and framing techniques." The weight of evidence finally began to crack Bobby's composed facade, frustration replacing calculation in his expression. "You don't understand. They were ruining our lives, he burst out, his voice rising with genuine emotion for the first time. The grounding was just the last straw. It was always rules and consequences, and we're only doing this because we love you. Dad threatened to tell MIT about the grade changing. MIT. Do you have any idea how that would have affected my future? The outburst provided a glimpse into the genuine motive, not merely teenage rebellion against discipline, but narcissistic rage at having future aspirations threatened by parental intervention. So you decided their lives were worth less than your college acceptance, Martinez stated, not as a question, but as a simple articulation of the twisted logic that had led to murder. Bobby's eyes flashed with anger at this characterization, his careful performance finally giving way to the underlying personality disorder that Dr. Hayes had identified in her assessment. They didn't understand what they were throwing away, he insisted, his voice taking on a disturbing intensity. Mom was supposed to get it. She worked with teenagers, for God's sake. But she was just like all the other adults, thinking she knew what was best for us without listening to what we wanted. The pronoun shifted tellingly from I to we as Bobby unconsciously aligned himself with Oscar again, forgetting momentarily that his twin had already betrayed their united front. We had a plan. We were going to use the money from the grade changes to start a tech company after graduation, but they just saw it as cheating, not innovation. Detective Martinez maintained a neutral expression, despite the chilling rationalization unfolding before him. So you decided to kill them, he stated simply, bringing the conversation back to the central reality that Bobby was still attempting to obscure with justifications. The teenager fell silent, his gaze dropping to the table as the magnitude of what he had participated in momentarily penetrated his psychological defenses. It wasn't supposed to be like that, he finally said, his voice quieter but lacking genuine remorse. Just Dad. He was the one pushing for the harsh punishment, threatening to contact colleges. Mom was collateral damage. The clinical terminology revealed the profound emotional disconnection that had allowed the twins to stab their parents multiple times without hesitation or mercy. In the observation room, Prosecutor Wilson nodded with grim satisfaction at this partial admission. "We've got him," she confirmed to Coleman. Maybe not a full confession of premeditation for both victims, but enough to corroborate Oscar's account and establish Bobby's participation and state of mind. Dr. Hayes agreed, though her expression remained troubled as she observed Bobby's body language. "What concerns me most is the complete absence of empathy or remorse," she noted professionally. "Even now, he's calculating how to minimize consequences rather than processing the human impact of his actions. These are classic markers of antisocial personality disorder, though a formal diagnosis would be premature given his age." Martinez continued building on the partial breakthrough, asking specific questions about the weapons used, the planning process, and the attempt to frame Rebecca Winters. Bobby provided limited responses, admitting to certain elements while continuing to position Oscar as the primary aggressor, particularly regarding Nydia's murder. "I never told him to kill Mom," he insisted repeatedly, as if this distinction somehow mitigated his culpability. That was all him. He completely lost it when she started screaming, just kept stabbing her even after she stopped moving. The detective noted each admission for the record, recognizing that even this self-serving account provided damning evidence of Bobby's presence, awareness, and participation in the premeditated attack on his father that foreseeably led to his mother's death as well. As the interrogation approached its fourth hour, Bobby's energy visibly flagged, the constant mental effort of manipulating the narrative taking its toll. Martinez recognized the opportunity in this fatigue and pressed harder on the details of the cleanup process, where the physical evidence was most damning to Bobby's claim of minimal involvement. "Your blood was mixed with your parents' in the bathroom drain, Bobby," he reminded the teenager. "Not just Oscar's, yours too. How did your blood get there if you were just a bystander? Bobby hesitated, recognizing the trap, but too mentally exhausted to construct a plausible explanation. I cut myself trying to stop Oscar, he finally offered, though the lack of conviction in his voice betrayed the lie. Martinez shook his head, producing photographs of Bobby's hands taken during processing, unmarked except for defensive wounds on his parents' hands, indicating they had tried to ward off knife attacks. "No cuts, Bobby," the detective stated flatly. "No injuries consistent with your version of events. But we did find traces of your parents' blood under your fingernails, despite your thorough shower afterward, microscopic evidence that you were in close physical contact with them during the attacks." Bobby stared at his hands as if seeing them for the first time, the physical evidence rendering his carefully constructed alternative narrative unsustainable. "I want a lawyer," he finally stated, invoking his rights as Martinez had anticipated he eventually would once the weight of evidence became overwhelming. "That's your right," Martinez acknowledged, gathering his files and standing to signal the end of the interrogation. "But before I go, there's one more thing you should know. Your brother didn't just confess, Bobby. He provided a written timeline of the entire planning process, including your researching Rebecca's schedule to ensure she'd be on air during the murders, your suggestion to plant her hair at the scene, and your specific instructions about which knives to use based on blade length and ease of handling. This final revelation, partly truth, partly tactical exaggeration, was calculated to undermine any remaining sense of solidarity Bobby might feel toward his twin, ensuring the brothers would remain psychologically separated during the coming legal proceedings. The strategy worked. Bobby's expression hardened with renewed betrayal and anger toward Oscar, any lingering twin bond shattered by the realization that his brother had provided detailed evidence against him. "He is lying about half of that," Bobby snapped, unable to resist one final attempt to control the narrative despite invoking his right to counsel. "It was his idea to use Rebecca's hair. He's the one who found her old hairbrush in the garage and said it was perfect for framing her." Martinez nodded without comment, making a note of this additional admission before leaving the room, the door closing behind him with a definitive click that symbolically sealed Bobby Abrams' fate as effectively as his own words had done. The Shelby County Courthouse stood imposing against the clear October sky, its classical architecture a stark contrast to the thoroughly modern horror of the case about to be heard within its walls. Television news vans lined the street outside, reporters doing stand-ups for morning broadcasts exactly 1 year after the murders that had shocked Memphis and captured national attention. Today marks the beginning of preliminary hearings in the case against Bobby and Oscar Abrams, the 16-year-old twins accused of murdering their parents in what prosecutors are calling a cold, calculated act motivated by teenage rebellion and thwarted ambition, a CNN correspondent reported, the courthouse steps serving as her backdrop. Inside, security was unusually tight, the high-profile nature of the case and the defendant's youth creating a volatile mixture of public interest and procedural caution. Prosecutor Victoria Wilson arrived early, her tailored navy suit and confident stride projecting the competence and determination that had earned her a reputation as one of Memphis's most effective attorneys for the state. At 42, the same age Nydia Abrams had been when she was murdered, Wilson felt a personal connection to the case, particularly given her own teenage sons at home. "This case isn't just about punishing two young killers," she had explained to her team during preparation. "It's about sending a message that family conflict, no matter how intense, cannot justify the taking of human life." Her case files were meticulously organized, with Oscar's confession, the forensic evidence, and Detective Martinez's comprehensive investigation providing a formidable foundation for the prosecution's case against both brothers, despite their divergent strategies since arrest. The defense had elected to separate the twins' legal representation, recognizing the inherent conflict created by Oscar's confession implicating his brother. Bobby was represented by Russell Harrington, a IC high-priced criminal defense attorney known for aggressive tactics and media savvy, while Oscar's family had retained Sarah Chen, a former public defender specializing in juvenile cases who would focus on mitigation rather than acquittal, given her client's cooperation. This strategic division became immediately apparent as the attorneys arrived separately, Harrington stopping to make brief comments to the press about his client's rushed and deeply flawed investigation, while Chen slipped into the courthouse through a side entrance, avoiding cameras altogether. Inside courtroom 3B, Judge Harold Phillips prepared for the hearing, reviewing the case file with the grave attention it deserved, despite his 30 years on the bench having exposed him to humanity's darkest impulses. At 63, Phillips was known for his no-nonsense approach and particular intolerance for crimes against children or by children. The Abrams case falling into the latter category, with its teenage perpetrators but carrying elements of both in his view, given the betrayal of the fundamental parent-child relationship. Counsel will refrain from turning these proceedings into a media circus, he informed both prosecution and defense teams during the pre-hearing conference in his chambers. The defendant's age does not diminish the seriousness of these charges, nor does it entitle them to procedural exceptions beyond those already established for juvenile offenders being tried as adults. The twins were brought into the courtroom separately, their matching faces and builds creating an eerie symmetry, despite their now divergent legal paths. Bobby entered first, dressed in a blue button-down shirt and khaki pants provided by his defense team, to project a clean-cut, scholarly image at odds with the brutal crimes described in the charging documents. He scanned the courtroom with calculated awareness, his gaze lingering on the media representatives allowed inside, clearly conscious of the impression he was creating for potential jurors who might later see this footage. Oscar followed minutes later, his demeanor markedly different, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. The weight of his confession and betrayal of his twin evident in his body language as he took his seat at the defense table without acknowledging his brother's presence just feet away. "All rise," the bailiff announced as Judge Phillips entered, the formality of the court contrasting sharply with the primal nature of the crimes under consideration. After preliminary matters were addressed, Prosecutor Wilson rose for her opening statement, her voice clear and measured, as she outlined the state's case against the Abrams twins. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that on the morning of October 8, 2022, the defendants, Bobby and Oscar Abrams, executed a premeditated plan to murder their parents, Michael and Nydia Abrams, in their family home," she began, her tone somber but firm. This was not an impulsive act of teenage rebellion, but a calculated response to being disciplined for their operation of a sophisticated grade-changing scheme at Memphis Central High School, for which they charged other students $500 per altered grade. Wilson moved methodically through the evidence, describing the crime scene, the attempted framing of Rebecca Winters, and the twins' behavior in the aftermath, attending school as if nothing had happened, while their younger brother Mark later discovered their parents' bodies. The state will present forensic evidence, including DNA samples, footprint matches, and weapon analysis that conclusively ties both defendants to these brutal murders, she continued, glancing briefly toward the twins. Most damning, Your Honor, is defendant Oscar Abrams' detailed confession, provided voluntarily after being confronted with this evidence, which outlines not only the execution of the murders, but the months of planning that preceded them, including specific roles each defendant played in the killings and subsequent cover-up attempt. The defense attorneys presented contrasting approaches in their opening statements, reflecting their divergent strategies. Russell Harrington, representing Bobby, aggressively challenged the investigation's methods and timeline. "The state has built its case on the unreliable confession of a frightened teenager, extracted through psychologically coercive interrogation techniques and without proper representation, he argued, his theatrical style a calculated appeal to emotion rather than legal substance. Bobby Abrams was not present during the tragic events that took the lives of Michael and Nydia Abrams, and the physical evidence allegedly connecting him to these crimes is circumstantial at best, contaminated at worst. His claims drew a subtle headshake from Detective Martinez, who sat behind the prosecution table, well aware that the interrogation had been conducted with meticulous adherence to procedure, recorded in its entirety, and with all appropriate Miranda warnings properly administered. Sarah Chen's opening on behalf of Oscar took a markedly different approach, acknowledging her client's role while emphasizing his cooperation and the contextual factors that led to the crime. Oscar Abrams does not deny his involvement in these tragic events, she stated simply, her quiet dignity commanding attention despite her lack of dramatic flourish. However, the evidence will show that Oscar was under the psychological influence of his twin brother, who conceived and directed the plan that led to their parents' deaths. This strategy, essentially positioning Oscar as both perpetrator and victim, drew a visible reaction from Bobby, whose carefully controlled expression briefly shifted to outrage before his attorney placed a cautioning hand on his arm, reminding him that his performance of innocence required consistent maintenance in the courtroom. The first witness called by the prosecution was Detective James Martinez, whose testimony would establish the foundation of the state's case and introduce the physical evidence collected during the investigation. After being sworn in, Martinez provided his credentials: 22 years with the Memphis Police Department, 15 in homicide, with specialized training in forensic evidence collection and interrogation techniques. Wilson guided him through the initial crime scene response, allowing him to describe in professional detail the bodies of Michael and Nydia Abrams, as discovered by first responders following Mark's 911 call. The living room showed signs of a violent struggle, with overturned furniture and significant blood spatter, consistent with multiple stab wounds, Martinez testified, referring to crime scene photographs displayed on monitors visible to the judge. Michael Abrams was found face down near the sofa with 17 stab wounds, primarily to his back and neck, indicating he was attacked from behind without warning. The detective continued with clinical precision, describing Nydia's wounds and positioning in the kitchen, the bloody footprint in the upstairs hallway, and the recovery of the murder weapons from a storm drain along the alternate route the twins had taken to school that morning. Laboratory analysis confirmed that blood from both victims was present on both knives, and the blade designs matched the wounds documented by the medical examiner, Martinez explained, his testimony building the timeline that would prove crucial to establishing the twins' guilt. Furthermore, surveillance footage from Memphis Central High School shows the defendants arriving at 7:32 a.m. through the east entrance, approximately 22 minutes after the latest estimated time of death, based on body temperature and lividity, providing a narrow but feasible window for them to commit the murders, perform minimal cleanup, and walk to school. When Wilson introduced the DNA evidence, Martinez explained how blood found in the bathroom drain contained genetic material from both victims and both defendants, directly contradicting Bobby's claim of non-involvement. While familial DNA can share similarities, the analysis conclusively identified 4 distinct profiles in the drain sample: Michael Abrams, Nydia Abrams, Bobby Abrams, and Oscar Abrams, he testified, referencing the laboratory reports entered as evidence. This indicates that both defendants had blood on them that was washed off in the upstairs bathroom following the murders, consistent with Oscar's confession stating that they showered and changed clothes before going to school. Harrington objected repeatedly during this testimony, challenging the collection methods and chain of custody. But Judge Phillips overruled most objections after Wilson established proper documentation for each evidence item. The most dramatic moment of Martinez's testimony came when Wilson asked him to describe the interrogation that led to Oscar's confession. Initially, both defendants maintained their innocence, claiming they had left for school before the murders occurred, the detective recounted. However, when presented with the physical evidence, particularly the DNA match and the footprint comparison, Oscar Abrams began showing signs of psychological distress, eventually stating, and I quote, "It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Dad was just supposed to get hurt enough to understand he couldn't control us anymore, but then Mom came in and everything went wrong." This direct quote from the recorded interrogation caused a stir in the courtroom, Oscar's head dropping even lower, while Bobby maintained his mask of indignant innocence despite the damning testimony. During cross-examination, Harrington attempted to undermine Martinez's credibility by suggesting that the detective had targeted the twins prematurely, overlooking other potential suspects. "Isn't it true that you initially focused your investigation on Rebecca Winters, the victim's father's ex-wife, detective?" he asked, pacing dramatically before the witness stand. Martinez remained unruffled. "We followed the evidence, counselor," he replied evenly. "Initial indicators pointed to Ms. Winters based on threatening messages and physical evidence that we later determined had been deliberately planted by the defendants to frame her, a conclusion supported by Oscar's confession and browser history showing research on framing techniques." This response effectively neutralized Harrington's attempted redirection, leaving the defense attorney visibly frustrated as he returned to his seat after several more unsuccessful lines of questioning. The prosecution's second witness was Dr. Eleanor Hayes, the forensic psychologist who had observed the twins' interrogations and analyzed their behavior throughout the investigation. Her testimony provided crucial context for understanding the psychological dimensions of the crime, particularly the calculated nature of the twins' actions before and after the murders. Both defendants displayed consistent patterns of duping delight, the satisfaction that liars often experience when they believe they are successfully deceiving others, Dr. Hayes explained, her academic background lending weight to observations that might otherwise seem subjective. This was particularly evident in Bobby's interrogation, where his body language, eye contact patterns, and vocal modulation all indicated someone performing grief rather than experiencing it authentically. Dr. Hayes continued by analyzing the differences in the twins' psychological profiles despite their identical genetic makeup. Bobby consistently demonstrated characteristics associated with narcissistic and antisocial tendencies, a sense of superiority, lack of empathy, manipulation of others, and rage when thwarted, she testified, referring to notes she had taken during the investigation. Oscar exhibited many similar traits, but with a critical difference. He showed susceptibility to influence and a greater capacity for guilt once his deception failed, as evidenced by his eventual confession and cooperation. This assessment provided support for Chen's defense strategy for Oscar, while simultaneously strengthening the case against Bobby as the driving force behind the murders, creating a subtle tension between the twins' defenses that the prosecution had anticipated and planned to exploit. The morning session concluded with the testimony of the medical examiner, Dr. Samuel Reeves, who provided detailed analysis of the victim's wounds, confirming the prosecution's theory that two different attackers had used two different knives. The angles and depth patterns of Michael Abrams' wounds indicate a right-handed attacker of approximately the same height as the victim, while Nydia Abrams' wounds show characteristics consistent with a left-handed attacker, Dr. Reeves testified, supporting the evidence that Bobby, right-handed, had primarily attacked his father while Oscar, left-handed, had killed his mother. Additionally, the force used in Michael's wound suggests a single determined attacker, while the variability in Nydia's wounds indicates possible hesitation marks before deeper, more decisive stab wounds, consistent with someone initially reluctant but then committing fully to the attack. When court reconvened after lunch, Wilson called the twins' younger brother, Mark Abrams, to the stand, a decision that had been carefully considered given the boy's traumatic experience and the potential psychological impact of testifying against his brothers. Now 13, Mark entered the courtroom with his maternal grandmother beside him as support person, his thin frame and haunted expression a stark reminder of the collateral damage caused by his brother's actions. After being sworn in with modified language appropriate for his age, Mark took the witness stand, his eyes deliberately avoiding looking at either twin as Wilson gently guided him through his testimony regarding the morning he discovered his parents' bodies and the conversation he had overheard the night before the murders. "I was homesick from school that morning," Mark explained, his voice barely audible, until the judge kindly asked him to speak up for the record. "Bobby and Oscar had already left for school, at least that's what I thought. When I went downstairs to get some water, I found—" His voice caught, tears welling, as he relived the traumatic discovery. After taking a moment to compose himself with encouragement from his grandmother and the judge, Mark continued, "I found Mom and Dad on the floor. There was so much blood. I called 911 right away." Wilson then carefully transitioned to the crucial testimony about the conversation Mark had overheard, asking him to recount what he remembered hearing the night before the murders. "I got up to use the bathroom around midnight, and I heard Bobby and Oscar arguing in their room," Mark testified, his young voice steadying as he focused on accurately reporting what he had heard. Bobby said something like, "It has to be tomorrow morning before school," and Oscar said he wasn't sure about something. Then Bobby told him to stop being weak, and that they'd never have another chance with both of them being grounded. The boy paused, swallowing hard before adding the detail that directly contradicted Bobby's claim of non-involvement. Then Bobby said, "I'll take care of Dad. You handle Mom if she comes in. We have to be quick so we have time to clean up before school." This testimony visibly affected Oscar, who closed his eyes as if in pain, while Bobby maintained his composed facade despite the devastating impact of his younger brother's words. Under cross-examination, Harrington attempted to discredit Mark's testimony by suggesting that trauma and grief might have affected his memory, or that he could have misinterpreted an innocent conversation. "Isn't it possible, Mark, that you heard your brothers talking about confronting your parents about their punishment, not planning to harm them?" the defense attorney suggested, his tone deliberately gentler than his usual aggressive style, given the witness's age. Mark shook his head firmly, showing unexpected resilience. "No, they specifically talked about taking care of Mom and Dad and cleaning up afterward," he insisted, his certainty unshaken despite Harrington's attempts to introduce doubt. "I thought they meant like having a serious talk, but after what happened, I know what they really meant." The prosecution's final witness for the preliminary hearing was Emma Chen, the classmate who had noticed blood under Oscar's fingernail on the morning of the murders. Her testimony corroborated the timeline and provided independent verification of physical evidence that the twins had attempted to conceal. "I sit behind Oscar in calculus class, which is first period," she explained, her demeanor confident despite the courtroom setting. "That morning I noticed his hands were shaking when he was taking notes, and there was definitely something red under his fingernail, the right index finger. I remember, specifically, because he kept trying to clean it with his other nail during class." This observation, initially deemed insignificant by Emma until she learned of the murders, provided further evidence that the twins had committed the crimes shortly before arriving at school, with at least Oscar retaining visible blood evidence despite their cleanup efforts. As the prosecution rested its case for the preliminary hearing, Judge Phillips addressed both defense teams regarding their options. Sarah Chen, representing Oscar, indicated that her client would not be presenting evidence at this stage, effectively acknowledging that probable cause existed to proceed to trial. Russell Harrington, however, announced his intention to call Bobby to testify, a high-risk strategy that indicated the defense's desperation given the mounting evidence. Your Honor, my client wishes to exercise his constitutional right to testify regarding these false allegations, Harrington stated formally, though his expression betrayed concern about this course of action. Judge Phillips advised Bobby directly about his Fifth Amendment rights and the implications of testifying, ensuring the record reflected that the defendant understood he was waiving his right to remain silent for the purposes of this hearing. Bobby Abrams took the stand with the practiced confidence that had characterized his behavior throughout the investigation, his testimony a study in controlled denial as he systematically rejected every element of his brother's confession and the physical evidence presented by the prosecution. I had nothing to do with my parents' deaths, he stated firmly, making deliberate eye contact with Judge Phillips. Oscar has always been troubled, always blamed others for his problems. Now he's blaming me because he can't face what he did alone. This calculated betrayal of his twin, throwing Oscar entirely under the proverbial bus, drew a visible reaction from his brother, whose attorney placed a restraining hand on his arm as Oscar half rose from his seat, the fraternal bond that had once united them now irrevocably severed by mutual betrayal. Wilson's cross-examination of Bobby was methodical and devastating, challenging each denial with corresponding physical evidence, timeline discrepancies, and direct contradictions from multiple witnesses. If you weren't involved, Mr. Abrams, how do you explain your blood mixed with your parents in the bathroom drain? She asked, maintaining eye contact that Bobby for the first time struggled to hold. Or your DNA under your mother's fingernails? Or your browser history showing searches for perfect murder techniques and how to frame someone for a crime? Each question chipped away at Bobby's composure, his responses growing increasingly defensive and contradictory as Wilson systematically dismantled his alternative narrative. By the time she concluded her cross-examination, Bobby's performance of innocence had crumbled into transparent falsehood, his final insistence that Oscar is lying about everything ringing hollow against the mountain of corroborating evidence. Judge Phillips wasted little time in delivering his ruling following closing arguments from both sides. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds that probable cause exists to believe that both defendants, Bobby Abrams and Oscar Abrams, committed the crimes of first-degree murder as charged in the indictment, he stated formally, his expression grave as he addressed the courtroom. The defendants will be bound over for trial in circuit court, with arraignment scheduled for 2 weeks from today. As the twins were led from the courtroom in handcuffs, their identical faces now marked by divergent expressions, Bobby's cold anger contrasting with Oscar's resigned acceptance, the preliminary hearing concluded with what observers and legal analysts alike recognized as a decisive victory for the prosecution and a preview of the full trial to come. The circuit courtroom of the Shelby County Justice Center hummed with tense anticipation as spectators, media representatives, and legal teams filed in for the first day of what was already being called the trial of the century in Memphis media. Court officers maintained strict decorum, the high-profile nature of the case having attracted national attention and necessitating enhanced security protocols throughout the proceedings. Judge Harold Phillips entered precisely at 9:01 a.m., his black robes seeming to absorb the light in the wood-paneled courtroom as he took his seat at the bench, the traditional call to all rise momentarily unifying the divided audience before he gestured for everyone to be seated. This court is now in session in the case of the State of Tennessee versus Bobby Abrams and Oscar Abrams, the clerk announced, officially beginning the trial that would determine the fate of the 16-year-old twins accused of murdering their parents. The defendants entered separately, both wearing suits provided by their respective defense teams, but creating markedly different impressions despite their identical genetic makeup. Bobby walked with deliberate confidence, his posture straight and his gaze direct, embodying the calculated performance that had characterized his behavior since the murders. Oscar, by contrast, moved with the hunched shoulders and downcast eyes of someone already accepting responsibility, his cooperation with prosecutors having separated him irrevocably from his twin, both legally and psychologically. The brothers were seated at different defense tables on opposite sides of the courtroom, a physical manifestation of their shattered relationship and divergent legal strategies, Bobby maintaining complete innocence while Oscar sought leniency through cooperation, each now viewing the other as a betrayer rather than an ally. Jury selection had been completed over the previous week, a painstaking process given the extensive media coverage and community awareness of the case. The final panel of 12 jurors and 4 alternates represented a cross-section of Memphis society, diverse in age, race, and occupation, but united in their sworn commitment to evaluate the evidence objectively despite the sensational nature of the crimes and the youth of the defendants. As they filed into the jury box, several glanced curiously at the twins, perhaps noting the physical similarities that contrasted so sharply with their now divergent legal paths. Judge Phillips addressed them directly, reminding them of their duties and the unique challenges of this case. You must set aside any preconceptions from media coverage and judge this case solely on the evidence presented in this courtroom, remembering that despite the defendant's age, they are being tried as adults due to the nature of the charges. Prosecutor Victoria Wilson rose for her opening statement, her navy suit and pearl necklace projecting professional gravitas as she approached the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about betrayal in its most fundamental form, the betrayal of parents by their children, the sacred trust of family, violated in the most violent way imaginable, she began, her voice clear and measured, despite the emotional weight of her words. The evidence will show that on October 8, 2022, the defendants, Bobby and Oscar Abrams, executed a premeditated plan to murder their parents, Michael and Nydia Abrams, simply because they had been grounded for running an illegal grade-changing scheme at their high school. Wilson paused, allowing this central motive to register with the jury before continuing, her timing demonstrating the experienced prosecutor's understanding of psychological impact. Moving methodically, Wilson outlined the state's case, describing how the twins had researched perfect murders and framing techniques in the months leading up to the killings, how they had selected kitchen knives as their weapons, and how they had attempted to frame their father's ex-wife, Rebecca Winters, by planting her hair at the crime scene. The evidence will show that Bobby Abrams, using a right-handed grip consistent with his dominant hand, stabbed his father 17 times in the back and neck, while Oscar Abrams, who is left-handed, stabbed his mother 23 times in the chest and abdomen, she continued, her clinical description contrasting with the horror of the acts described. After the murders, they showered, changed clothes, disposed of the weapons in a storm drain, and attended school as if nothing had happened, leaving their 12-year-old brother Mark to discover their parents' bodies hours later. The prosecutor then addressed the divergent positions of the defendants, acknowledging Oscar's confession while emphasizing that both twins bore equal responsibility for the premeditated murders. Oscar Abrams has admitted his role in these horrific crimes and provided details that match the physical evidence collected by investigators, Wilson noted, gesturing toward Oscar's table where he sat with downcast eyes. Bobby Abrams continues to deny any involvement, despite overwhelming forensic evidence, including his DNA mixed with his parents' blood in the bathroom drain, his fingerprints on items at the crime scene, and testimony from his younger brother who overheard the twins planning the murders the night before they were committed. This strategic framing established Oscar's confession as corroboration rather than the sole basis for the prosecution's case, addressing a key vulnerability Harrington had attempted to exploit during the preliminary hearing. Wilson concluded by reminding the jury of their solemn responsibility to deliver justice for Michael and Nydia Abrams, emphasizing that the defendants' youth did not diminish the premeditated nature of their crimes. The evidence will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Bobby and Oscar Abrams deliberately planned and executed the murders of their parents with cold calculation, attempted to frame an innocent woman, and believed their intelligence would allow them to escape consequences, she stated firmly, making eye contact with individual jurors. At the conclusion of this trial, the state will ask you to return verdicts of guilty against both defendants for 2 counts each of first-degree murder, regardless of their age or the misguided notion that parental discipline justified such a brutal response. Russell Harrington's opening statement for Bobby offered a stark contrast to Wilson's measured approach, his theatrical style immediately evident as he moved dynamically around the courtroom, voice modulating for dramatic effect. Ladies and gentlemen, what you've just heard is a narrative built on assumption, misinterpretation, and the coerced confession of a deeply troubled teenager trying to shift blame to his innocent brother, he declared, his gesture toward Oscar containing undisguised contempt. The prosecution wants you to believe that Bobby Abrams, a 16-year-old honor student with no history of violence, transformed overnight into a cold-blooded killer simply because he was grounded, a preposterous leap of logic that ignores the fundamental presumption of innocence that is the cornerstone of our justice system. Harrington's strategy became immediately clear: create reasonable doubt by presenting Oscar as the sole perpetrator who implicated Bobby to reduce his own culpability. The evidence will show that Oscar Abrams, acting alone and driven by psychological issues his therapist parents tragically failed to address, committed these horrible acts without Bobby's knowledge or participation, he claimed, contradicting not only Oscar's confession, but the substantial physical evidence linking both twins to the crime scene. Bobby was not present during these killings, did not assist in planning them, and has been falsely accused by a brother seeking to mitigate his own guilt through the oldest tactic in the criminal playbook, blaming someone else. Sarah Chen's opening on behalf of Oscar took a markedly different approach, acknowledging her client's guilt while contextualizing his actions within the psychological dynamics of the twin relationship and their family environment. Oscar Abrams does not deny his involvement in the deaths of his parents, she stated simply, her quiet dignity commanding attention despite following Harrington's theatrical performance. He has accepted responsibility through his cooperation with investigators and will not ask you to find him not guilty of these charges. This forthright acknowledgment seemed to surprise some jurors who had perhaps expected uniform denials from both defense teams, but Chen quickly clarified the nuanced position she would present. However, the evidence will also show that Oscar acted under the influence and direction of his twin brother, whose psychological dominance over Oscar had been established throughout their lives and who conceived, planned, and initiated the violence that led to these tragic deaths. Chen continued by outlining the psychological framework that would contextualize Oscar's actions without excusing them, introducing the concept of twin dynamics and the particular vulnerability of the less dominant twin in identical pairs. Expert witnesses will explain how Oscar's identity development was sublimated to Bobby's more dominant personality, creating a psychological dependency that made it extremely difficult for Oscar to oppose his brother's will, particularly in high-stress situations, she explained, her approach less emotional but no less strategic than Harrington's, seeking mitigation rather than acquittal. This evidence is not presented to absolve Oscar of responsibility, but to provide the complete context necessary for you to understand the true dynamics behind these tragic events and to consider during the penalty phase should you find him guilty. The prosecution's case began with testimony from first responders who had arrived at the Abrams home following Mark's 911 call, establishing the crime scene and the initial evidence collection process. Officer Tanya Reynolds, who had been first to arrive, described finding Mark huddled in the hallway and the bodies of Michael and Nydia Abrams in the living room and kitchen respectively. The boy was in shock, repeating, "Who would do this?" over and over, she testified, her professional demeanor occasionally yielding to evident compassion when describing the 12-year-old's traumatic discovery. The scene indicated extreme violence, blood spatter on walls and furniture, defensive wounds on both victims' hands, and multiple stab wounds, visible even before the medical examiner's examination. Forensic technicians followed, presenting detailed analysis of blood pattern evidence, the recovered murder weapons, and DNA samples collected throughout the Abrams home. The prosecution methodically built their timeline, establishing that the murders occurred between 6:40 and 7:10 a.m., that two different attackers using two different knives had killed Michael and Nydia respectively, and that someone had attempted to clean up in the upstairs bathroom afterward, leaving traces of all four family members' DNA in the drain. Crime scene photographs displayed on courtroom monitors showed the brutal reality of the attacks, causing several jurors to visibly wince despite efforts to maintain professional detachment. Bobby remained stoic during this presentation, his expression carefully neutral, while Oscar periodically closed his eyes or looked down, seemingly unable to face the visual evidence of what he had participated in. The prosecution's case strengthened significantly with the testimony of Emma Chen, the classmate who had noticed blood under Oscar's fingernail on the morning of the murders. "I sit directly behind Oscar in calculus, which is first period," she explained, her confident demeanor contrasting with her youth. "That morning I noticed his hands were shaking when he was taking notes, and there was definitely something red under his fingernail. I thought it was ink at first, but it wasn't." Harrington's cross-examination attempted to suggest she had misremembered or been influenced by later knowledge of the murders, but Emma remained firm. "I specifically remember because it was unusual. Oscar is usually very neat, but that morning his hands were trembling and he kept trying to clean his fingernail during class." Mark Abrams's testimony provided the emotional center of the prosecution's case. The 13-year-old's courage in facing his brothers across the courtroom, drawing sympathetic glances from several jurors. Supported by his grandmother, who sat in the front row, Mark recounted discovering his parents' bodies and the devastating realization that his brothers were responsible. "I heard them planning it the night before, but I didn't understand what they meant," he testified, his voice steady despite the obvious emotional toll. "Bobby said, 'I'll take care of Dad. You handle Mom if she comes in.' And Oscar kept saying he wasn't sure, but Bobby called him weak and said they had to do it before school." Harrington's cross-examination was notably gentler than his usual aggressive style, recognizing the risk of appearing to badger a traumatized child, but his attempts to suggest misinterpretation gained no traction against Mark's clear recollection and evident sincerity. The prosecution's case culminated with Detective James Martinez's testimony, which synthesized the physical evidence, timeline, and confessional statements into a comprehensive narrative of premeditation, execution, and attempted cover-up. Martinez walked the jury through the investigation chronologically, from the initial focus on Rebecca Winters based on the planted evidence to the eventual discovery of the twins' involvement through forensic analysis and Oscar's confession. We recovered search histories from a laptop hidden in the defendant's bedroom showing research on perfect murders, framing techniques, and specifically researching Rebecca Winters' radio schedule to ensure she would have an alibi during their planned attack time, he explained, referencing evidence logs and screenshots displayed for the jury. This demonstrated not only premeditation, but a sophisticated attempt to direct suspicion toward their father's ex-wife. Martinez then described the interrogation process that led to Oscar's confession, presenting audio recordings that allowed the jury to hear the teenager's actual voice as he admitted his role in the murders and implicated his brother. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. Oscar's recorded voice echoed through the courtroom, the audio quality capturing his distress as his deception unraveled. Dad was just supposed to get hurt enough to understand he couldn't control us anymore, but then Mom came in and everything went wrong. Bobby visibly tensed during this playback, his carefully maintained composure cracking momentarily as he heard his twin's betrayal in Oscar's own words, while Oscar himself kept his head bowed, unable to look at either the jury or his brother as his confession played in open court. The defense phase began with Sarah Chen calling psychological experts to testify about twin dynamics and Oscar's particular vulnerability to his brother's influence, establishing groundwork for mitigation rather than challenging the factual basis of the charges. Dr. Leonard Walsh, a specialist in adolescent psychology with expertise in twin relationships, explained the concept of twin dominance and its potential impact on moral decision-making. In identical twins, particularly males, one twin typically emerges as psychologically dominant, with the other developing a follower identity that can persist throughout adolescence, Dr. Walsh testified, referring to research studies and his own clinical observations. This doesn't eliminate moral agency, but it can significantly complicate resistance to the dominant twin's influence, especially in families where the parents may inadvertently reinforce this dynamic by treating the twins as a unit rather than as individuals. Russell Harrington's defense of Bobby took a more aggressive approach, calling expert witnesses who challenged the forensic methodology and offered alternative explanations for the physical evidence linking his client to the crime scene. The presence of Bobby's DNA in the family bathroom is entirely expected given that he lived in the home and used that bathroom daily, argued defense forensic expert Dr. Elaine Winters, deliberately downplaying the significance of finding Bobby's blood mixed with his parents' in the drain. Cross-contamination during evidence collection cannot be ruled out, particularly given the chaotic nature of the crime scene and the multiple technicians involved in processing. This line of argument gained little traction against the prosecution's meticulously documented evidence chain, but served Harrington's strategy of generating any possible reasonable doubt, however tenuous. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Oscar Abrams took the stand in his own defense, his testimony carefully structured by Chen to acknowledge guilt while emphasizing Bobby's role as the driving force behind the murders. "It was Bobby's idea," Oscar stated, his voice barely audible at first until Judge Phillips instructed him to speak up. "He started talking about it after we got caught for the grade-changing thing, said our parents were ruining our future, and we needed to eliminate the problem." Oscar described how the plan evolved over several weeks, with Bobby researching methods and directing preparations, while Oscar, despite misgivings, failed to oppose his twins' increasingly concrete plans. "I knew it was wrong, but whenever I tried to say, maybe we should just accept the punishment, Bobby would call me weak and say I was betraying him, and I'd always done what Bobby wanted for as long as I can remember." Oscar's description of the murders themselves was harrowing, his clinical detachment occasionally breaking into evident distress as he recounted the violence in detail. Dad was at the living room table with his coffee when Bobby attacked him from behind with the knife, he testified, staring at his hands rather than making eye contact with anyone in the courtroom. "He just kept stabbing him even after Dad fell. I was frozen, just watching, until Mom came in screaming and Bobby yelled at me to handle her or we'd both be caught." Tears finally broke through as Oscar described pursuing his mother into the kitchen. "She looked at me like she couldn't believe what was happening. She said, 'Oscar, please,' right before I stabbed her. I can still hear her voice, saying my name. Victoria Wilson's cross-examination of Oscar was measured but relentless, acknowledging his cooperation while ensuring the jury understood his full culpability regardless of who had initiated the plan. Despite your claimed reluctance, Mr. Abrams, you stabbed your mother 23 times, far more than would have been necessary if you were acting under duress or temporary impulse, she noted, referencing the medical examiner's report. Oscar nodded, unable to deny this damning fact, and afterward you showered, changed clothes, disposed of evidence, and went to school alongside your brother, participating in classes and conversations with friends as if nothing had happened. Is that correct? Again, Oscar could only acknowledge the truth. His claims of psychological domination by his twin, undermined by his evident capacity for calculated behavior in the murder's aftermath. Bobby Abrams's decision to testify in his own defense against Harrington's reported private advice revealed the narcissistic personality traits that psychologists had identified throughout the investigation. Taking the stand with practiced confidence, Bobby systematically denied any involvement in the murders, portraying himself as a victim of his brother's mental instability and the prosecution's rush to judgment. I had no idea what Oscar was planning to do that morning, he claimed, his voice steady and his eye contact with jurors carefully maintained. We left for school together like normal, and I didn't find out about my parents until the police came to get me from class. This version contradicted not only Oscar's testimony and the physical evidence, but also Mark's account of overhearing the twins' planning conversation, creating an alternative narrative that required the jury to disbelieve multiple witnesses and forensic findings. Wilson's cross-examination of Bobby became the defining moment of the trial, her methodical approach dismantling his testimony point by point with specific evidence contradictions. You claim you had no knowledge of the murders, yet your DNA was found mixed with your parents' blood in the bathroom drain. How do you explain that, Mr. Abrams? She asked, maintaining steady eye contact that Bobby, for the first time, struggled to hold. And how do you explain your fingerprints on the knife block where the murder weapons were stored, or the search history on your hidden laptop researching Perfect Murders and Rebecca Winter's schedule? Each question further eroded Bobby's composed facade, his responses growing increasingly defensive and contradictory as Wilson systematically exposed the implausibility of his denial narrative. The cross-examination reached its climax when Wilson confronted Bobby with his own words from the interrogation, playing the audio recording where he had inadvertently implicated himself while trying to shift blame to Oscar. I never told him to kill Mom. That was all him. He went crazy when she started screaming, stabbing her over and over even after she stopped moving. Bobby's face flushed with anger as his own voice echoed through the courtroom, the damning statement revealing knowledge he could only have possessed if present during the murders. That was taken out of context, he insisted, his composure finally cracking completely as he realized the impact of this evidence on the jury. I was just repeating what the detectives had told me about what happened. This desperate explanation rang hollow against the clear context of the recording, marking the effective end of any credibility his testimony might have retained. Closing arguments crystallized the competing narratives that had emerged during the 2-week trial, with Wilson synthesizing the overwhelming evidence against both defendants while acknowledging their different postures toward accountability. Oscar Abrams has admitted his guilt, and the evidence conclusively confirms his role in these premeditated murders, she reminded the jury, her tone somber but firm. Bobby Abrams continues to deny his involvement, despite DNA evidence, fingerprints, timeline confirmation, eyewitness testimony from his younger brother, and his own inadvertent admissions during interrogation. Both defendants planned these murders together, executed them together, and attempted to cover them up together. Their different approaches to this trial reflect only their current legal strategy, not their equal culpability for the deaths of Michael and Nydia Abrams. Sarah Chen's closing for Oscar focused on establishing mitigating factors for sentencing rather than challenging guilt, emphasizing her client's cooperation and recognition of responsibility. Oscar Abrams does not ask you to find him not guilty. He has admitted his role in these tragic events and will live with that guilt for the rest of his life, she stated, her quiet dignity a marked contrast to Harrington's theatrical style. However, when you consider your verdict and potential recommendations regarding sentencing, I ask you to remember the psychological context presented by our expert witnesses, the documented dominance dynamic between the twins, Oscar's lifelong pattern of deferring to Bobby's stronger personality, and his immediate cooperation once separated from his brother's influence. Harrington's closing argument for Bobby maintained the denial strategy despite its increasing implausibility in the face of overwhelming evidence, positioning his client as a victim of circumstantial evidence and his brother's false accusations. The prosecution has failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Bobby Abrams participated in these murders, he insisted, his rhetoric increasingly disconnected from the factual record established during trial. They ask you to believe that a 16-year-old honor student with no history of violence suddenly became a cold-blooded killer because he was grounded, a narrative that defies logic and common sense, when the simpler explanation is that Oscar acted alone and implicated his brother to reduce his own culpability. This argument appeared to gain little traction with the jury, several of whom exchanged skeptical glances during Harrington's more tenuous claims. Judge Phillips's instructions to the jury were comprehensive, explaining the legal standards for first-degree murder, the requirement for proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and the process for deliberation. You must consider each defendant separately, evaluating the evidence specific to their individual actions and intent, he explained, acknowledging the unusual circumstance of co-defendants with divergent defense strategies. Oscar Abrams's admission of guilt does not automatically implicate Bobby Abrams. You must evaluate all evidence presented regarding Bobby's involvement independently. The judge also provided instructions regarding the potential sentencing phases that would follow guilty verdicts, explaining that as juveniles being tried as adults, the defendants would face separate sentencing hearings if convicted, where additional evidence relevant to appropriate punishment would be presented. The jury deliberated for just 7 hours before reaching unanimous verdicts for both defendants, remarkably swift given the case complexity, but reflecting the overwhelming strength of the prosecution's evidence, particularly against Bobby, despite his continued denials. As the courtroom reassembled to receive the verdicts, tension permeated the space, the twins seated at their separate tables presenting a study in contrasts, Oscar resigned and slump-shouldered, Bobby maintaining his facade of confident innocence despite its increasing transparency to observers. The clerk read the verdicts with formal detachment. In the case of the State of Tennessee versus Oscar Abrams, on the count of first-degree murder of Michael Abrams, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of first-degree murder of Nydia Abrams, we find the defendant guilty. Oscar closed his eyes briefly but showed no other reaction, having already acknowledged his guilt throughout the proceedings. For Bobby, whose denial strategy had collapsed under the weight of evidence, the identical verdict landed with visible impact, his carefully maintained composure finally shattering as reality overwhelmed performance. In the case of the State of Tennessee versus Bobby Abrams, on the count of first-degree murder of Michael Abrams, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of first-degree murder of Nydia Abrams, we find the defendant guilty. Bobby's face flushed with anger, his hands gripping the table edge so tightly his knuckles whitened, the narcissistic rage that had driven the murders now directed at the jurors who had seen through his deception. "This is wrong! They're all lying!" he burst out, Harrington placing a restraining hand on his arm that Bobby shook off violently. "Oscar's lying, Mark's lying, they're all lying." Court officers moved quickly to control the situation as Judge Phillips ordered Bobby to compose himself or be removed from the courtroom, the outburst providing a final damning glimpse of the volatile personality that had orchestrated the murder of his parents 1 year earlier. The sentencing phase of the Abrams twins' trial began 1 week after the guilty verdicts, with the courtroom atmosphere heavy with the weight of what was to come. Since Tennessee law permitted life sentences without parole for juveniles convicted of first-degree murder in cases of exceptional depravity or premeditation, both prosecution and defense teams prepared extensively for this crucial stage that would determine whether the 16-year-old twins would ever have the possibility of freedom. Judge Harold Phillips had ordered separate sentencing hearings for each defendant, acknowledging their different positions regarding responsibility and cooperation, Oscar's admission of guilt and extensive cooperation with investigators, contrasting sharply with Bobby's continued denial and courtroom outburst following the verdict. The prosecution would present its case for maximum sentencing, first for Bobby, then for Oscar, with defense mitigation evidence following in each instance. The state seeks life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for defendant Bobby Abrams, Prosecutor Victoria Wilson stated firmly as the sentencing hearing began, her tone reflecting the gravity of the recommendation. While we recognize the defendant's chronological age of 16 at the time of the murders, the evidence has demonstrated a level of premeditation, callousness, and psychological maturity that justifies the maximum sentence permitted under Tennessee law for juvenile offenders. Wilson had prepared meticulously for this phase, knowing that recommending life without parole for a juvenile required clearing significant constitutional hurdles established by the Supreme Court in Miller v. Alabama, which required individualized consideration of a juvenile offender's youth and attendant characteristics before imposing such a severe sentence. Wilson methodically outlined the factors supporting the state's sentencing recommendation, beginning with the extensive evidence of premeditation. Bobby Abrams didn't commit these murders in a moment of teenage impulse or without understanding the consequences of his actions, she explained, displaying timeline evidence showing months of planning. His internet search history reveals research on perfect murders beginning more than 6 months before the killings, with specific searches about knife angles, fatal stab wounds, and blood evidence removal in the weeks leading up to October 8th. This evidence directly countered potential arguments that the crime represented impulsive behavior typical of adolescent brain development, instead demonstrating calculated, long-term planning more characteristic of adult criminal thinking. The prosecutor continued by addressing Bobby's psychological evaluation, which had been conducted following the guilty verdict as part of standard pre-sentencing procedure. 3 separate psychologists evaluated the defendant and all identified significant traits associated with antisocial personality disorder, including profound lack of empathy, grandiose sense of self-worth, and absence of remorse, Wilson noted, referencing reports submitted to the court. Dr. Eleanor Hayes specifically noted that Bobby Abrams displays psychological sophistication well beyond his chronological age, with cognitive and emotional patterns typically seen in adult offenders rather than juveniles. This assessment directly addressed the constitutional requirement to consider adolescent brain development in juvenile sentencing, providing evidence that Bobby's psychological functioning operated outside typical developmental patterns for his age group. Perhaps most compelling was Wilson's presentation regarding Bobby's behavior following the murders, not just the killings themselves, but his calculated performance of grief, manipulation of the investigation, and continued denial despite overwhelming evidence. After stabbing his father 17 times, Bobby Abrams showered, changed clothes, went to school, participated in classes, and returned home that afternoon to begin his performance as the grieving son when his younger brother discovered their parents' bodies, she recounted, the clinical description highlighting the emotional detachment required for such behavior. This wasn't panic or shock. This was the calculated behavior of someone who believed himself superior to those investigating the crime, someone convinced his intelligence would allow him to escape consequences regardless of evidence. Wilson concluded her sentencing argument by addressing Bobby directly, though her words were technically directed to the court. The defendant has shown no remorse, accepted no responsibility, and displayed no recognition of the magnitude of his actions in taking his parents' lives, she stated firmly. He continues to blame his brother exclusively, despite overwhelming evidence of his own planning and participation. This combination of premeditation, psychological sophistication beyond chronological age, and complete absence of remorse justifies the maximum sentence permitted under Tennessee law: life imprisonment without possibility of parole. Russell Harrington's mitigation presentation for Bobby faced significant challenges given his client's continued denial of involvement, despite the jury's guilty verdict. Unable to argue remorse or acceptance of responsibility, Harrington instead focused on Bobby's age, academic potential, and family dysfunction as mitigating factors. Despite the jury's verdict, which my client respects while maintaining his innocence, the court must consider that Bobby Abrams was 16 years old at the time of these events, a chronological fact that cannot be dismissed regardless of psychological assessments, he argued, emphasizing recent Supreme Court precedents regarding juvenile sentencing. Neuroscience confirms that adolescent brains are not fully developed, particularly in areas governing impulse control and consideration of long-term consequences. Harrington presented character witnesses, including Bobby's former teachers and a distant aunt, who testified to his academic brilliance and leadership potential prior to the murders. Bobby was consistently ranked first in his class, with teachers predicting he would attend an Ivy League university and achieve significant professional success, noted his calculus teacher, though cross-examination revealed the same teacher had documented concerns about Bobby's arrogance toward authority figures and dismissive attitude toward school rules. The defense also presented evidence of family dysfunction, arguing that Michael and Nydia Abrams' parenting style had contributed to psychological pressure on their sons, particularly their mother's professional focus on other children, while allegedly overlooking warning signs in her own home. The most dramatic moment of Bobby's sentencing hearing came when he exercised his right to address the court before sentencing, rising to speak, despite Harrington's visible concern about what his client might say. "Your Honor, I stand before you convicted of crimes I did not commit," Bobby began, his voice steady but underlying anger evident in his tightly controlled delivery. "I have been betrayed by my twin brother, who committed these acts alone and then implicated me to save himself." This continued denial, directly contradicting the extensive evidence presented at trial, visibly affected Judge Phillips, whose expression remained neutral but whose gaze sharpened as he observed Bobby's performance. For performance it clearly was. The calculated delivery and strategic eye contact revealing the same manipulative patterns identified by psychological experts throughout the proceedings. Bobby continued by positioning himself as a victim of circumstance and betrayal rather than showing any recognition of the jury's verdict or the impact of his parents' deaths. "I had a promising future that has been stolen from me by this miscarriage of justice," he declared, the self-focus of his statement, notable for its complete absence of reference to his parents as human beings rather than obstacles. "I ask the court to consider that I am 16 years old, that until these false accusations I had never been in trouble with the law, and that the maximum sentence would destroy any possibility of my contributing to society in the future." The statement contained no expression of grief for his parents, no acknowledgement of his younger brother's trauma, and no recognition of the extensive evidence that had led to his conviction, only continued self-positioning as the true victim in the case. Judge Phillips's expression remained inscrutable throughout Bobby's statement, but his questions afterward revealed his assessment of the defendant's sincerity. "Mr. Abrams, you've spoken at length about the impact of this verdict on your future," the judge noted, his tone measured, but pointed. "Have you given any thought to the impact of your parents' deaths on your younger brother Mark, who not only lost his parents, but discovered their bodies and has now lost his brothers as well?" Bobby appeared momentarily thrown by this direct confrontation with the human consequences of the murders, his rehearsed narrative not having prepared him for such a question. "Mark was manipulated by the prosecution," he responded, after a visible hesitation, reverting to his denial strategy rather than engaging with the emotional reality the judge had highlighted. "He's confused about what he heard that night. He's just a kid." This response seemed to confirm Judge Phillips's assessment, his follow-up question even more direct. "Throughout this trial and your statement today, you've referred to your parents primarily as obstacles to your ambitions, rather than as human beings who raised you for 16 years. Do you feel any grief at all about their deaths, regardless of who you believe is responsible?" Bobby's response revealed the emotional disconnection that had enabled the murders in the first place. His answer focused entirely on how his parents' deaths had affected him, rather than any recognition of their humanity. "Of course, I'm upset they're gone. My life has been destroyed because of what happened to them," he stated, the narcissistic framework of his worldview transparently evident in this formulation that positioned his parents' murders primarily as events that had negatively impacted his plans rather than as the tragedy of two lives violently ended. Oscar Abrams's sentencing hearing presented a stark contrast to his twins, beginning with Victoria Wilson's more measured sentencing recommendation. The state recognizes Oscar Abrams's cooperation throughout this investigation and his acceptance of responsibility for his actions, the prosecutor acknowledged, her tone notably different from her approach to Bobby's sentencing. However, the facts remain that Oscar Abrams actively participated in the premeditated murder of his parents, stabbing his mother 23 times and helping to cover up both killings afterward. Wilson recommended life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 51 years, still effectively a life sentence, but acknowledging Oscar's cooperation and potential for rehabilitation with the symbolic possibility of eventual freedom in his late 60s. Sarah Chen's mitigation presentation for Oscar, built on the foundation established during trial, acknowledging guilt while contextualizing his actions within the psychological dynamics of the twin relationship and family environment. Oscar Abrams does not ask for forgiveness or claim that his actions were justified, Chen stated clearly, establishing the fundamental difference between her client's position and Bobby's continued denials. He accepts responsibility for his role in these tragic deaths and acknowledges that he must face severe consequences. Our presentation today seeks only to provide context that may inform the court's determination of whether Oscar, despite his terrible crimes, demonstrates potential for rehabilitation that would justify eventual parole consideration in the distant future. The defense presented extensive psychological testimony regarding twin dynamics and Oscar's particular vulnerability to Bobby's influence, including documentation from early childhood showing the establishment of their dominant submissive relationship. From preschool reports through high school records, we see a consistent pattern of Bobby making decisions for both boys, speaking for Oscar in social situations, and Oscar deferring to his brother's judgment even when it conflicted with his own interests, testified Dr. Sarah Winters, a child psychologist specializing in twin relationships. This doesn't negate Oscar's moral agency or responsibility, but it provides essential context for understanding how a 16-year-old with no prior violent behavior participated in such a horrific act under his brother's direction. Perhaps most compelling was testimony from Oscar's juvenile detention counselor regarding his behavior since being separated from Bobby's influence. In the 10 months since his arrest, Oscar has shown consistent signs of genuine remorse and psychological development, noted counselor James Richardson, who had met with Oscar weekly throughout his detention. He has nightmares about his mother's final moments, has written letters of apology to his younger brother Mark, though these haven't been sent at the prosecutor's request, and has actively participated in every therapeutic opportunity available in the juvenile facility. This testimony suggested potential for rehabilitation that directly contrasted with Bobby's continued manipulation and denial, providing the court with a meaningful distinction between the twins despite their equal participation in the physical acts of murder. Oscar's statement to the court provided the emotional center of his sentencing hearing, his voice barely audible at first as he addressed Judge Phillips without notes or apparent rehearsal. "I killed my parents, and nothing I can say will ever change that or make it right," he began, tears forming immediately, though he maintained enough composure to continue speaking. "Every day I hear my mom's voice saying my name right before I stabbed her. Her last word was my name, asking me not to hurt her. I'll hear that for the rest of my life." Unlike Bobby's self-focused statement, Oscar's words centered on his parents as human beings and the irreversible harm he had caused, particularly to his younger brother Mark. "I destroyed our family. Mark lost everyone because of what Bobby and I did, and he'll never get his childhood back." "I'm sorry, Mark," he said, addressing his absent brother, directly though the 13-year-old was not present in the courtroom, having chosen not to attend the sentencing hearings. Judge Phillips engaged with Oscar more extensively than he had with Bobby, asking questions that probed the sincerity of his remorse and his understanding of his actions. "When did you first begin to feel remorse for what you had done, Mr. Abrams?" the judge inquired, watching Oscar's response closely. "During the interrogation, when Detective Coleman showed me the pictures of Mom and Dad," Oscar replied, his voice steadier as he engaged directly with the question. "When Bobby wasn't there telling me what to say or how to act, it all hit me at once. What we'd done, that they were really gone forever because of us. I threw up right there in the interrogation room." This account matched Detective Coleman's report of the interview, lending credibility to Oscar's claim of genuine emotional response once separated from his twins' influence. Expert testimony from psychologists formed a significant portion of both sentencing hearings, with particular focus on the twins' psychological development and potential for rehabilitation. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, who had observed both brothers throughout the investigation and trial, provided particularly illuminating comparative analysis. Despite their identical genetic makeup, Bobby and Oscar Abrams display markedly different psychological profiles regarding capacity for empathy, insight, and potential rehabilitation, she testified, referencing extensive testing and behavioral observations. Bobby demonstrates classic traits of antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic features including profound lack of empathy, grandiose sense of self, and manipulation of others for personal gain, traits that neuroscience research indicates are highly resistant to therapeutic intervention, even in adolescence. Hayes continued by contrasting Oscar's psychological profile, noting significant differences despite the twins' shared genetics and environment. Oscar displays concerning traits including emotional detachment and susceptibility to influence, but also shows capacity for empathy, guilt, and insight that was not evident in his brother's assessment, she explained, citing Oscar's cooperation and emotional responses during evaluation. When presented with photographs of his parents, Oscar demonstrated physiological stress responses consistent with genuine emotional distress, while Bobby showed no measurable autonomic response to the same images. This physiological evidence provided objective support for the subjective impression that Oscar's remorse reflected genuine emotional processing, while Bobby's occasional performance of appropriate emotions masked fundamental emotional detachment. The most poignant testimony came from the twins' maternal grandparents who had taken custody of Mark following the murders and struggled to reconcile their grief for their daughter with their grandson's responsibility for her death. "We lost our daughter and son-in-law in the most horrible way imaginable," Elizabeth Carter testified, her voice steady despite evident emotion. "Now we're raising Mark, who wakes up screaming from nightmares about finding his parents covered in blood. He's afraid to sleep alone, afraid his brothers will somehow come after him too." This testimony humanized the ongoing impact of the murders beyond the immediate victims, highlighting the ripple effects of trauma through the extended family, particularly for Mark, as the surviving innocent sibling, now separated from his entire immediate family. When asked about their position regarding sentencing, the grandparents offered a nuanced perspective that distinguished between the twins based on their post-arrest behavior rather than their equal culpability in the murders themselves. "We can never forgive what happened to our daughter and son-in-law," Elizabeth stated firmly. "But we recognize that Oscar has admitted what he did and shown what appears to be genuine remorse, while Bobby continues to deny responsibility and shows no concern for what Mark has suffered." While not explicitly advocating for specific sentences, this testimony provided powerful victim impact perspective that acknowledged the difference in the twins' approaches to accountability despite their equal participation in the physical acts of murder. Dr. Lillian Park, who had worked alongside Nydia Abrams in her psychology practice, provided particularly affecting testimony about the professional irony of a child psychologist failing to recognize dangerous behavioral patterns in her own sons. Nydia was brilliant with her patients, especially troubled teenagers exhibiting early warning signs of conduct disorders, Dr. Park explained, having collaborated with the victim for over a decade. The tragic irony is that she appears to have missed or minimized similar warning signs in Bobby particularly. Colleagues had occasionally noted his controlling behavior toward Oscar and his apparent lack of emotional attachment, but Nydia would attribute this to normal sibling dynamics or academic focus. This testimony highlighted the complex family dynamics that had contributed to the tragedy without diminishing the twins' responsibility for their deliberate actions. On the final day of the sentencing proceedings, Judge Phillips addressed the courtroom before delivering his decision, acknowledging the exceptional nature of the case and the constitutional considerations required when sentencing juvenile offenders to life imprisonment. The Supreme Court has established that juvenile offenders are constitutionally different from adults for purposes of sentencing, with greater capacity for change and less moral culpability due to their developmental stage, he noted, referencing Miller v. Alabama and subsequent cases establishing this legal framework. However, the court has also recognized that in rare cases involving heinous crimes and particular individual factors, life without parole may be constitutionally permissible for juvenile offenders after individualized consideration of their youth and attendant characteristics. The judge continued by addressing each defendant individually, beginning with Bobby. In the case of Bobby Abrams, the court finds that, despite his chronological age of 16 at the time of these murders, the evidence demonstrates a level of premeditation, psychological sophistication, and complete absence of remorse that justifies the most severe sentence permitted under Tennessee law for juvenile offenders, he stated, his tone grave but firm. The extensive planning, the calculated attempt to frame an innocent person, the complete lack of empathy displayed throughout the investigation and trial, and the defendant's continued refusal to acknowledge responsibility despite overwhelming evidence all indicate that rehabilitation prospects are extremely poor. Turning to Oscar, Judge Phillips offered a more nuanced assessment, while still emphasizing the severity of his crimes. In the case of Oscar Abrams, the court acknowledges his acceptance of responsibility, cooperation with investigators, and expressions of remorse that appear genuine based on multiple expert assessments, he noted, distinguishing between the twins without minimizing Oscar's participation in the murders. However, the court cannot overlook the fact that Oscar Abrams actively participated in planning these murders, personally stabbed his mother 23 times, and assisted in covering up both killings afterward. His subsequent remorse, while relevant to rehabilitation potential, does not diminish the premeditated nature of these horrific crimes against his parents. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Phillips prepared to announce the sentences, the culmination of a year-long legal process that had begun with the discovery of Michael and Nydia Abrams' bodies by their youngest son, and would now determine the futures of their killers. Bobby Abrams, having been found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, this court sentences you to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole on each count, to be served consecutively, the judge pronounced, his voice resonating through the hushed courtroom. Based on the specific circumstances of these crimes and your individual characteristics as established through extensive testimony, the court finds that you represent the rare juvenile offender for whom this most severe sentence is both constitutionally permissible and appropriate. Bobby's reaction was immediate and volatile, his careful performance of controlled innocence shattering completely as the reality of spending his entire life in prison registered fully. "You can't do this to me," he shouted, rising from his seat despite Harrington's restraining hand on his arm. "I'm 16 years old. This isn't justice." Court officers moved quickly to control the situation as Bobby continued his outburst, his mask of calculated composure replaced by the rage that had driven the murders of his parents 1 year earlier. "I'll appeal this. All of you will regret this," he continued, as officers escorted him from the courtroom, his threats and protests fading as the door closed behind him, leaving a charged silence in his wake. Judge Phillips maintained his composure throughout Bobby's outburst, waiting for order to be restored before addressing Oscar, who had remained seated with his head bowed during his twins' dramatic exit. "Oscar Abrams, having been found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, this court sentences you to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 51 years on each count, to be served concurrently," he stated. The distinction between the twin sentences, subtle but significant, in its acknowledgment of Oscar's cooperation and potential for eventual rehabilitation. This sentence recognizes the heinous nature of your crimes while acknowledging your acceptance of responsibility and the possibility, however distant, of rehabilitation over the next 5 decades. Oscar received his sentence with quiet acceptance, nodding slightly as the judge concluded, his eyes remaining downcast. "I understand, Your Honor. Thank you," he responded softly when asked if he wished to comment, the simple acknowledgement contrasting sharply with his twins' continued protests, still faintly audible from the holding area. As Oscar was led from the courtroom, Judge Phillips offered final remarks that captured the tragedy that had unfolded in this Memphis family and would continue to reverberate through the lives of all connected to it, particularly young Mark Abrams. "No sentence this court could impose can restore what was lost on October 8th, 2022, the judge observed solemnly. 2 lives were taken by those who should have cherished them most, and 3 young lives were forever altered, 2 by their own terrible choices, and 1 by the innocent discovery of what his brothers had done. Life without parole," Judge Harold Phillips's decisive words echoed through Courtroom 3B of the Shelby County Justice Center as he pronounced sentence on Bobby Abrams, the 16-year-old who, along with his identical twin Oscar, had brutally murdered their parents after being grounded for running a grade hacking scheme at their high school. The judge's stern expression reflected the exceptional nature of sentencing a juvenile to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, a punishment reserved for the most heinous crimes committed by minors who demonstrated adult-level premeditation and a profound lack of rehabilitation potential. The packed courtroom absorbed the pronouncement in stunned silence, the finality of the sentence settling over the proceedings like a heavy shroud, broken only by Bobby's immediate outburst of rage and entitlement that served to confirm, in many observers' minds, the appropriateness of the maximum sentence despite his youth. 1 year after the October morning when Mark Abrams had discovered his parents' blood-soaked bodies in their suburban Memphis home, the legal proceedings that had captivated the city and drawn national attention were drawing to a close. Oscar Abrams, also 16 but distinguished from his identical twin by his cooperation with investigators and apparent remorse, received a marginally less severe sentence, life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 51 years, a theoretical chance at freedom in his late 60s that acknowledged his acceptance of responsibility without diminishing the gravity of stabbing his mother 23 times. As Oscar was led from the courtroom in handcuffs, his shoulders hunched and head bowed in the posture that had become characteristic since his confession, spectators observed the profound physical similarity and equally profound psychological divergence between the twins who had shared DNA, home, and horrific crimes, but now faced their punishments with dramatically different attitudes. Today's sentences reflect both the heinous nature of these premeditated murders and the individualized assessment of each defendant as required by the Supreme Court when sentencing juvenile offenders to life imprisonment, Prosecutor Victoria Wilson told reporters gathered on the courthouse steps after the proceedings concluded. The fall sunshine illuminated her composed features as she addressed the media, her navy suit and pearl necklace, projecting the same professional gravitas that had characterized her successful prosecution of one of Memphis's most disturbing murder cases. Bobby Abrams represents the rare juvenile offender for whom life without parole is both constitutionally permissible and appropriate, given his extensive planning, complete lack of remorse, and psychological sophistication well beyond his chronological age. Wilson's careful phrasing reflected the legal framework established by Miller v. Alabama and subsequent cases, which required individualized consideration of a juvenile offender's youth and developmental characteristics before imposing life without parole. Wilson continued her statement by addressing Oscar's slightly less severe sentence, emphasizing that the distinction recognized his cooperation rather than diminishing his culpability for the murders themselves. While Oscar Abrams received life with the theoretical possibility of parole after 51 years, it's important to understand that this reflects his acceptance of responsibility and cooperation with investigators, not a lesser role in these horrific crimes, she explained, maintaining the balanced approach that had characterized her prosecution throughout. Both defendants actively participated in planning and executing the murders of their parents, and both attempted to frame an innocent person for their crimes. The difference in their sentences reflects only their different approaches to accountability after arrest, not their equal culpability for the murders of Michael and Nydia Abrams. Defense attorneys offered contrasting responses to the sentences, reflecting the divergent strategies they had pursued throughout the trial. Russell Harrington, who had represented Bobby through an aggressive denial strategy despite overwhelming evidence, announced immediate plans to appeal both the conviction and sentence. Today's sentence represents a miscarriage of justice against a 16-year-old young man whose case was prejudiced by his brother's coerced confession and media coverage that made a fair trial impossible, Harrington declared, maintaining the denial narrative despite the jury's unanimous guilty verdict and Judge Phillips's detailed explanation of the factors justifying the maximum sentence. Legal analysts observing the case noted that Harrington's approach seemed calculated more toward preserving his professional reputation than serving his client's interests, as the aggressive denial strategy had likely contributed to Bobby receiving the harsher sentence by preventing any consideration of remorse or acceptance of responsibility. Sarah Chen, who had represented Oscar with a strategy acknowledging guilt while seeking mitigation, offered a more measured response that reflected her client's acceptance of the court's judgment. Oscar Abrams understands the severity of his crimes and accepts the sentence imposed by the court, she stated simply, declining to characterize the outcome as either victory or defeat. While we had hoped the court might give greater weight to the psychological dynamics of twin relationships and Oscar's genuine remorse, we respect Judge Phillips's thoughtful consideration of all factors in this complex case. Chen confirmed that while she would file standard appeals to preserve her client's legal rights, Oscar had instructed her not to pursue aggressive challenges to his conviction, having accepted responsibility for his mother's murder despite the mitigating factor of his brother's psychological influence. The sentencing marked the effective end of what Memphis media had dubbed the honor roll murders, a case that had forced the community to confront uncomfortable questions about teenage mental health, parental discipline, and the capacity of seemingly high-functioning adolescents to harbor homicidal rage beneath a veneer of academic achievement and social conformity. Local schools had implemented enhanced psychological screening protocols in the wake of the murders, with particular attention to high-achieving students showing signs of entitlement or disproportionate rage when facing consequences for rule violations. Nydia Abrams's colleagues in the child psychology community had organized professional development focusing on the recognition of warning signs in adolescents regardless of academic performance or social status, acknowledging the tragic irony that a respected child psychologist had missed such signs in her own home. For Detective James Martinez, who had led the investigation from the discovery of the bodies through the twins' eventual arrest and conviction, the case represented both professional validation and psychological burden. In 22 years of homicide investigation, I've never encountered juvenile offenders who maintained such calculated deception after committing such brutal crimes, he reflected during a post-sentencing interview with the Memphis Commercial Appeal. The image of Bobby and Oscar Abrams attending school, normally just hours after stabbing their parents, then returning home to perform shock and grief when their younger brother discovered the bodies. That level of compartmentalization in 16-year-olds is something that will stay with me throughout my career. Martinez had requested a brief leave of absence following the trial's conclusion, the cumulative weight of the case's disturbing elements requiring professional processing, despite his experienced investigator's perspective. The most profound impact beyond the legal proceedings and community responses remained with 13-year-old Mark Abrams, who had lost his entire immediate family in a single morning, his parents to murder and his brothers to prison. Now living with his maternal grandparents in a different state under a new surname to protect his privacy, Mark continued to receive intensive psychological support to address the trauma of discovering his parents' bodies and the compound betrayal of learning his brothers were responsible. Mark is showing remarkable resilience given the circumstances, his court-appointed advocate reported during a sealed update to Judge Phillips following the sentencing. But he continues to experience nightmares, anxiety in social situations, and profound trust issues that will require ongoing therapeutic intervention throughout adolescence and likely into adulthood. The advocate's report included excerpts from Mark's therapy sessions that revealed the complex emotions the young boy harbored toward his imprisoned brothers. "Sometimes I hate them so much I can't breathe," Mark had confided to his therapist during a particularly difficult session. "But then I remember how Bobby would help me with math homework or how Oscar taught me to ride a bike, and I get confused about how they could be those brothers and also be killers. This psychological ambivalence, the cognitive dissonance of reconciling loving memories with horrific betrayal, represented one of the most significant challenges in Mark's ongoing recovery, his therapist noting that integrating these contradictory realities would be a years-long process requiring patience and specialized support. Mark had made the difficult decision not to attend his brother's sentencing hearings, a choice his grandparents and therapeutic team had supported as appropriate for his psychological well-being. "I don't want to see them," he had explained when discussing the option with his advocate. "I don't want to remember them in handcuffs or prison clothes. I want to remember them from before, even though that means I'm remembering something that wasn't really true." This poignant articulation of his need to preserve some aspect of his family narrative, despite knowing it contained fundamental deception, demonstrated both Mark's emotional intelligence and the complex grief process he faced in coming to terms with his brother's actions and their consequences for his own life and identity. The Abrams family home, where the murders had occurred, stood empty 1 year after the crime, its value diminished by the notorious events that had taken place within its walls, despite the affluent East Memphis neighborhood surrounding it. After remaining unsold for months despite significant price reductions, the property had finally been purchased by a real estate investment company specializing in rehabilitating properties with troubled histories. Neighbors reported mixed feelings about the planned extensive renovation that would transform the home's appearance, some viewing it as necessary to move beyond the tragedy, while others questioned whether such cosmetic changes could ever truly erase the knowledge of what had happened there on that October morning. Nydia and Michael Abrams were remembered through several community initiatives established in the wake of their murders, efforts to create meaning from tragedy while honoring the positive contributions they had made before their lives were cut short. The Nydia Abrams Memorial Scholarship provided financial support for graduate students pursuing careers in child psychology with a focus on early intervention for at-risk adolescents, while the Michael Abrams Youth Mentorship Program paired successful professionals with teenagers from underserved communities, offering guidance and support during critical developmental years. These programs represented attempts to extract something positive from the senseless loss, though friends and colleagues acknowledged that such memorials could never replace the lives and potential that had been extinguished. For Rebecca Winters, the father's ex-wife, whom the twins had attempted to frame for the murders, the conclusion of the legal proceedings brought a measure of formal vindication, but little psychological closure. Being falsely implicated in such horrific crimes, having detectives show up at my workplace and my personal life scrutinized in the media, these experiences don't simply disappear when the truth finally emerges, she explained, during a rare interview granted to address misconceptions that continued to circulate despite her proven innocence. "There are still people who look at me differently, who wonder if there was some truth to the allegations despite the overwhelming evidence of my innocence." Rebecca had filed a civil suit against several media outlets that had published particularly sensationalized coverage of her initial status as a person of interest, seeking damages for defamation and emotional distress, resulting from their failure to update their reporting with equal prominence once her alibi was confirmed. The psychological community took particular interest in the Abrams case, with numerous journal articles and conference presentations examining the unusual aspects of identical twins jointly committing patricide and matricide with such calculated premeditation. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, who had evaluated both twins and testified at their trial, published a landmark paper in the Journal of Forensic Psychology titled "Mirror Image Killers: Divergent Psychological Pathways in Identical Twins Committing Familicide," which became required reading in graduate programs nationwide. Despite identical genetic material and shared environmental influences, Bobby and Oscar Abrams developed meaningfully different psychological profiles that manifested most clearly in their post-arrest behavior, Hayes wrote in her introduction. This case provides a unique opportunity to examine how inherited traits interact with dominance dynamics in twin relationships to produce divergent moral reasoning and capacity for remorse, despite shared participation in extreme violence. Bobby and Oscar Abrams began serving their sentences at separate maximum security facilities, the Department of Corrections deliberately placing them in different regions of the state to prevent any communication or coordination between them. Bobby was assigned to Northwest Correctional Complex in Tiptonville, while Oscar entered the prison system at Morgan County Correctional Complex in Wartburg, both facilities having specialized units for younger offenders where they would remain until turning 18, at which point they would transition to the general adult population. Prison officials reported that the twins' divergent responses to sentencing had continued into the early weeks of incarceration, with Bobby filing multiple grievances and displaying hostility toward staff, while Oscar had entered the system quietly, requesting educational materials and accepting assignment to mandated counseling without resistance. Legal experts continued to debate the appropriateness of life without parole for Bobby, given his age at the time of the murders, with some advocacy organizations filing amicus briefs supporting his appeal based on general opposition to such sentences for juveniles regardless of their crimes. The sentence imposed on Bobby Abrams, while understandable given the horrific nature of his crimes, raises fundamental questions about our society's approach to juvenile justice and rehabilitation, argued Professor James Wilson of Vanderbilt Law School in a widely circulated opinion piece. Can we definitively state that a 16-year-old, regardless of the calculated nature of his crimes, has no potential for meaningful change over the next 6 or 7 decades of life? Such theoretical arguments gained little traction with the Memphis community, however, where the details of the twins' crimes and Bobby's continued lack of remorse had left little public sympathy for abstract constitutional debates about his punishment. The case continued to resonate with the public long after the formal legal proceedings concluded. The combination of teenage killers, honor student facades, and the twisted psychology of twins murdering their parents, creating an enduring fascination reflected in books, documentaries, and even a theatrical play exploring the events from multiple perspectives. Twin Shadows, The Abrams Murders and American Justice, became a New York Times bestseller, its author having conducted extensive interviews with school classmates, teachers, and peripheral figures in the case to construct a comprehensive narrative of the events leading to the murders and their aftermath. A Netflix documentary series, Honor Roll Killers, the Bobby and Oscar Abrams story, drew criticism for its occasionally sensationalized approach, but was praised for its nuanced examination of adolescent psychology and the warning signs that had been missed by those around the twins, despite their mother's professional expertise in child development. On the first anniversary of the sentencing, Memphis journalist Eliza Washington published a reflective piece that captured the lingering questions and unresolved tensions the case had left in its wake. 1 year after Judge Phillips pronounced the words that gave this case its name, life without parole, Memphis continues to grapple with the implications of such extraordinary violence emerging from seemingly ordinary suburban lives, she wrote, her thoughtful analysis avoiding the sensationalism that had characterized much of the case coverage. Beyond the legal questions of juvenile sentencing and the psychological fascination with identical twins who killed their parents, the Abrams case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about adolescent development, family dynamics, and the limits of our ability to truly know even those closest to us. Washington's piece concluded with perhaps the most haunting aspect of the case, the profound irony that Nydia Abrams, a respected child psychologist specializing in troubled teenagers, had failed to recognize the dangerous psychological patterns developing in her own sons. Nydia Abrams spent her professional life helping parents identify warning signs of serious behavioral and emotional problems in their adolescent children, Washington observed. The tragic irony that she missed such signs in her own home, that her professional expertise did not protect her from becoming the victim of precisely the kind of disturbed adolescent behavior she helped others address, serves as a sobering reminder of the complexity of human psychology and the blind spots we all carry, even in our areas of greatest knowledge and expertise. This painful paradox, more than any other aspect of the case, continued to resonate with parents, educators, and mental health professionals long after the legal proceedings had concluded and the twins had begun serving their separate sentences for the murder of the parents who had raised them, disciplined them, and ultimately died at their hands in the family home on that October morning in Memphis.